Chapter 2506, Coming Back to Life. Chapter 2506, Coming Back to Life. A person that Ji Xueming had clearly killed suddenly stood back up. How could he not feel a chill rise up his spine at the sight? It should be known that while there were in this world supreme elites that could destroy stars and crumble the ground with a single move, and could evaporate the sea with a single breath, there was definitely no possible way a dead person could be revived. Yes, a heavenly venerate could do it, but even a heavenly venerate would have to pay an exorbitant price for it. It was definitely not something as simple as just a casual move. If it was to be claimed that Li Wan had been revived by a heavenly venerate, Ji Xueming wouldn't believe it, even if it killed him. But the problem here was that Li Wan really had stood up. Senior Sister Li. Luo Xing was filled with pleasant surprise, but at the same time also felt slightly cautious because who knew whether Li Wan was of the same flock as Ji Xueming, putting an act on for his sake merely for the sake of launching a sneak attack on him. Of course, the chance of this was too low. Luo Xing was already poisoned at present, and the enemy had as many as 11 ascending origin tiers. No matter how he thought, there would be no need to use such a low-handed trick. Ji Xueming. Li Wan spat out each word, her voice filled with fury. Ji Xueming forcefully kept his cool. He stared at Li Wan. I do not believe that a dead person can come back to life. You probably have some kind of treasure to substitute for you, right? How could Li Wan have anything? She only knew that a sword had struck her from behind, and she had been completely unguarded. But just when the blade of the sword had been about to touch the back of her head, a powerful force had pushed her down, and then she could not move at all. Hearing Ji Xueming's performance, she was practically exploding with anger. Subsequently, she suddenly recovered mobility and then stood back up. In truth, she was also very confused. Could it be that there was an elite helping them in secret? She naturally would not be giving him any explanation. She rebuked, "You shameless man, you will not get an easy death." Actually, Ji Xueming would not feel the slightest fear towards a living person. What he was concerned about now was just why Li Wan had managed to come back to life. He smiled slightly and said, "Senior Sister Li, could it be that you have forgotten my previous words? I have always been the type to leave nothing to chance." Clearly, it was not just Luo Xing he had poisoned. Even Li Wan had not been exempted. Li Wan's expression instantly changed. Ji Xueming stabbing her from behind should have only been a whim of his, as he just happened to have the opportunity to do so. But poisoning both her and Luo Xing definitely had to have been a long-planned conspiracy. He had the intentions, and they were unguarded against him. Who would have thought that a fellow disciple whom they had lived with for tens of millions of years would actually be an undercover agent from an enemy sect? Though I have to expend a little more effort, it has absolutely no effect on the greater picture, Ji Xueming said. With a wave of his hand, the 10 ascending origin tiers from the Red Flower sect immediately walked over, approaching Luo Xing and Li Wan. Both Li Wan and Luo Xing frowned deeply. Now that things had progressed this far, it seemed like they could predict their end by now. Sigh. Ling Han sighed. Was he really a bringer of calamity that would encounter trouble wherever he went? He had only wanted to find some place to settle down and ascertain the situation. Then he could find out where the Empress and the others were and go over calmly. Why wasn't he allowed to relax just a bit? Brother Ling, what are you sighing for? Ji Xueming asked laughingly. You have no need to fear. I will not kill you. I will study absolutely thoroughly a prodigy of cultivation like you. This kind of ability. I very much wish to possess it. To practically cultivate the hidden radiant stage completely within half a year's time was a kind of natural talent that could only be described as legendary, which filled him with curiosity as well as greed. Ling Han broke into a smile. Could it be that you are not curious just how this woman came back to life? Ji Xueming laughed loudly. Could it be it was you behind it, then? I have never coveted the merits of others, but I would not hide my actions, either. Of course it was me. Ling Han nodded. Ji Xueming would naturally not believe it. Ling Han was but a mere hidden radiant stage. If he did have that kind of strength, wouldn't even pigs fly? Kill them, he said lowly. The 10 members of the Red Flower sect charged out. They had long since lost their patience. Begone! Ling Han roared, and his voice instantly rumbled out like thunder, deafening and ear-splitting. Every single person felt their mind buzz, and then all that was left was a complete blank. When they came back to their senses, they were all looking at Ling Han with eyes filled with absolute shock. The might of a roar was actually so frightening. Just how terrifyingly strong was this person then? It really was you. Ji Xueming pointed a finger at Ling Han as he stuttered, his hand trembling slightly. Ling Han smiled faintly. He had secretly given Li Wan a slight shove when Ji Xueming had attacked just now. As for the blood, that was real. Li Wan had indeed sustained injury, but it was not too severe. He gave another shout. Azure Sun, Celestial King, please come out for a meeting. Boom! The sound turned into a terrifying ripple that reverberated throughout the peaceful Sun Mountain. The shouts of Luo Xing and Li Wan could not be transmitted because of their limited strength. But Ling Han's body art had directly reached the peak stage of the 5th heaven. With this shout, there was no issue to envelop the whole of the peaceful Sun Mountains. In merely an instant, a figure streaked through the air and arrived. This person was enshrouded in 2 streaks of peculiar light. This was a symbol that could not be any more obvious. This person was a 2nd heaven Celestial King, the Azure Sun Celestial King. How dare you? The Azure Sun Celestial King's eyes swept over them, and he instantly humphed. Members of the Red Flower sect actually dared come here to cause trouble. Were they really planning to step all over him? Though he could not travel far, it was fine for him to just leave slightly for a short while. Ji Xueming shuddered fearfully, and he knelt onto the ground with a sudden turn of his eyes. Master, you have finally come. I thought I would never be able to see you again. Both senior brother Luo and junior sister Li are traitors, and they were the ones who poisoned Missus. This, to say nothing of both Li Wan and Luo Xing feeling utter fury. Even Ling Han was slightly surprised. Could a person really be as shameless as this? Master, he is spouting rubbish. He is the undercover agent from the Red Flower sect. Luo Xing hurriedly exclaimed. Li Wan also nodded, repeatedly. The moment the Azure Sun Celestial King appeared, they had subconsciously ignored Ling Han, because in their hearts and eyes, their master was the strongest person of all, and Ling Han was not enshrouded by any peculiar light. So how could he be a Celestial King? The Azure Sun Celestial King naturally held his own judgment. Just look at the situation now. 10 elites of the Red Flower sect had surrounded Luo Xing and Li Wan, and Ji Xueming was standing outside of the siege. That's still not enough to describe the problem. Unfilial disciple. This Celestial King humphed coldly. Now that things had reached this point, he naturally understood the reason behind his wife's illness. He moved. Boom! The might of a Celestial King surged out. Even if there were 11 ascending origin tiers on Ji Xueming's side, so what? The difference between a Celestial King and an ascending origin tier was like the difference between an adult and an infant. No matter how big the advantage in numbers was, there was no way that the gap in strength between the 2 sides could be compensated. With the descent of a single palm strike, pa, 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 the 10 ascending origin tiers were all turned into pools of blood instantly, and Ji Xueming was apprehended. This unfilial disciple definitely could not be executed so easily. Ji Xueming trembled in fear. He was in despair, and his eyes were set on Ling Han. If it were not because of him, how could he have fallen to this? Ling Han shook his head. Ask yourself this question first. Do you have the right to fault others? This person is... The Azure Sun Celestial King looked towards Li Wan and Luo Xing. His name is Ling Han, and we encountered him at the Cloudy Dream Marsh. Just now, it seemed like he was the one who helped me out of a crisis, Luo Xing said. He could not distinguish Ling Han's strength at all, and could only offer a vague description. Oh! The Azure Sun Celestial King paused slightly. Friend, please join me on the mountain, and allow me to serve you some fragrant tea. Chapter 2507, Gifting a Mine. Chapter 2507, Gifting a Mine. Friend. Surprisingly, the Azure Sun Celestial King continued to refer to Ling Han as a friend. What did this signify? This signified that the Azure Sun Celestial King was willing to treat Ling Han as his equal, as someone with equivalent status to him, who could enjoy a status equivalent to Celestial Kings. Naturally, only fellow Celestial Kings. Gasp. Luo Xing and Li Wan were both stunned upon realizing this. Even though they had already harbored suspicions, they were still given a huge fright when this was confirmed. They had actually brought a Celestial King back. However, this person didn't look like a Celestial King at all. Ling Han smiled faintly and replied, "All right. Please," the Azure Sun Celestial King said as he gestured an invitation. He then grabbed his two disciples and flew away first, appearing relaxed and elegant as his robes billowed in the wind. However, his speed was in fact astonishing as he soared toward the mountain. Meanwhile, Ling Han calmly ran beside the Azure Sun Celestial King, not falling behind a single inch. Upon seeing this, Luo Xing and the others finally dispelled all of their doubts. Ling Han was definitely a Celestial King. Otherwise, how could his speed match that of the Azure Sun Celestial King? In fact, even the Azure Sun Celestial King was slightly shocked. No matter how he looked, Ling Han was only at the hidden radiant stage. It was only because of Ling Han's shout just then that he had confirmed that he was at the Celestial King tier. Otherwise, he wouldn't have rushed over in astonishment. In any case, he truly couldn't make head nor tail of Ling Han's situation. Even as a Celestial King, he was still filled with confusion. After arriving atop the mountain, Li Wan retrieved the golden-veined frog. This naturally delighted the Azure Sun Celestial King. This main medicine was truly far too difficult to obtain. Because of the Cloudy Dream Marsh's peculiar environment, even the vision of Celestial Kings would be severely affected. As such, trying to find a golden-veined frog there would be incredibly difficult. Moreover, he hadn't been able to leave either, so he had no option but to send his disciples out. Unexpectedly, they actually managed to surprise him with success. The Azure Sun Celestial King took his leave first, impatiently rushing away to concoct the medicine to save his wife. When he finally finished, 3 days had already passed. When he returned to meet Ling Han, he wore an extremely exhausted expression. However, this still couldn't conceal his excitement. "Thank you so much, friend," the Azure Sun Celestial King said as he clasped his hands in gratitude. If it weren't for Ling Han, they would have definitely failed to obtain the golden-veined frog. At the same time, it would have also been impossible to uncover that Ji Xueming was a traitor, and the Duplicate Moon sect might have truly suffered the terrible fate planned for them. It might have suddenly collapsed one day, and perhaps the Azure Sun Celestial King would have been able to flee, but his wife would definitely be killed. Thus, the Azure Sun Celestial King was extremely sincere when he expressed his gratitude. Ling Han calmly accepted his thanks, saying, "We can regard this as fate." The Azure Sun Celestial King naturally became even more moved. He talked about all matters under the sun with Ling Han, and this caused him to admire Ling Han even more. Ling Han also seized this opportunity to ask about the heavenly venerable tier. Even though the Azure Sun Celestial King's knowledge of this matter was limited, he at least still knew one important piece of information. That was 1,000,000 years ago, Heavenly Venerate Zhou Heng had returned with numerous supreme prodigies, placing all of them in the world's paramount martial academy. This had caused a huge stir. World's paramount. Ling Han repeated this in his mind, and he couldn't help but chuckle. With the Flaming Frost Realm being a super high-level dimension, and with so many heavenly venerates working together, this academy indeed had the right to be named as the world's paramount. Zhou Heng had said that it wasn't only him bringing prodigies to the academy. Several other heavenly venerates would also be bringing monarch tears and monarch stars over from the various dimensions, nurturing them in the hopes of producing more heavenly venerates. Thus, the world's paramount martial academy would definitely be brimming with supreme talents. Would there be freaks with an evolution index of 12? Most definitely. Ling Han's fighting spirit was instantly ignited. In fact, he was itching to immediately rush over to the world's paramount martial academy to spar with all of those prodigies. Ling Han asked for more detail about the world's paramount martial academy. Yet the Azure Sun Celestial King didn't know much about this topic. Ling Han was slightly disappointed upon learning this. Forget about it, he would worry about this when he went to the academy. In any case, it was inevitable that he would go. When they parted, the Azure Sun Celestial King directly gifted a mine to Ling Han in order to express his gratitude. Several days later, Ling Han appeared in this mine. What a sly person this Azure Sun Celestial King is, Ling Han said with a smile and a shake of his head. This was the mine that the Red Flower Sect and the Duplicate Moon Sect had been fighting over this entire time. In reality, it was still unclear who owned this mine. On one day, the Red Flower Sect might push the Duplicate Moon Sect away, and on another day, the opposite might happen. Thus, neither sect was able to mine this area. Now that the Azure Sun Celestial King had gifted this mine to Ling Han, his act of seeming generosity was actually accompanied by this troublesome baggage as well. From another perspective, the Azure Sun Celestial King was also greatly disheartened. In his fight for this mine, he had come extremely close to losing his wife. This allowed him to reach a realization. There was no need to care so much about some external matter. However, he was also unwilling to surrender this mine to the Red Flower Sect for no reason. Thus, gifting it to Ling Han was naturally the best course of action. He's also managed to transfer this trouble to me, Ling Han murmured. If the Red Flower Sect discovered his presence in the mines, they would definitely send people over to stop him. Thus, unless Ling Han was willing to abandon the mine, it was inevitable that they would clash. In any case, it was possible that divine metal existed in this mine. Even if this was only a possibility, Ling Han was still determined to explore it. He was in desperate need of divine metal. He needed to forge his own heavenly venerate tool. Ling Han continued to mull over other issues as he walked toward the mine. He definitely had to eliminate Heavenborn. However, a sliver of the karmic life Heavenly Venerable's imprint most likely existed inside Heavenborn, so would it be possible to destroy the latter's soul and allow the karmic life Heavenly Venerable to take over? If this were possible, wouldn't the karmic life Heavenly Venerable be reborn? With the karmic life Heavenly Venerable's prodigious talent, and with Heavenborn's incredible physique, just what kind of lofty height would he reach in the future? Ling Han was filled with eager anticipation upon thinking of this. He had never dreamed about being the lone hero in this world. Hysteria had reached the 7th tier of the Heavenly Venerable tier long ago, and it had more so transformed its own body into a dimension. Its strength was definitely paramount in the Genesis world. Slaying Hysteria by himself, that was simply impossible. Thus, the more 7th tier Heavenly Venerates there were, the better. After reaching a certain number, they could definitely rival Hysteria. When this number was surpassed, could they perhaps slay Hysteria and bring peace and tranquility back to the Genesis world? As long as Hysteria remained, the Genesis world would face the threat of being fully engulfed by it. At that time, everything would descend into desolation and destruction. Halt! Just as his mind was wandering, not paying attention to the surroundings, he suddenly heard the angry shout of someone. He looked up, only to see a mountain face before him. There were camps to either side, yet one of them was already empty. Meanwhile, The other camp was fervently constructing something. The person who had shouted at him was an ascending origin tier elite. He wore a gray hat, and his eyes were filled with sharpness and ferocity. It was clear that the duplicate moon sect had already retreated. Right now, the Red Flower sect was preparing to open this mine. Ling Han smiled and said, "The Azure Sun Celestial King has already gifted this mine to me. You guys don't need to worry about me, either. I'll leave after having a look around." He naturally couldn't care less about ordinary ore. He only needed divine metal. Haha, what an absolute fool, the man with the gray hat said with loud laughter. Swoosh! He dashed forward and viciously thrust forth his spear, causing the wind to whistle. Even though Ling Han only appeared to be at the hidden radiant stage, this man was an extremely careful person. Thus, he had attacked with his full strength, afraid that Ling Han had cultivated some technique that allowed him to conceal his true cultivation level. After all, the duplicate moon sect's sudden retreat was far too unreasonable. Thus, it was only natural that he acted with extreme caution. Ling Han simply ignored him as he continued to stride forward. Pum! The spear struck him, yet an even more terrifying power reverberated, causing the spear to instantly shoot back. The butt of the spear was blunt, yet it ruthlessly pierced through the heart of the man with the gray hat with a plop. Chapter 2508, Obtaining Divine Metal. Chapter 2508, Obtaining Divine Metal. The eyes of the man with the gray hat widened in shock and disbelief. He had actually been killed by his own weapon. The butt of the spear hadn't been decorated with symbols of slaughter, so being injured by it should only have resulted in ordinary flesh wounds. Yet, the man felt a terrifying aura crashing through his body, obliterating his life force and causing him to become weaker and weaker. He was on the verge of death. However, he was going to die a confused death. How could a measly hidden radiance stage brat possibly be so powerful? Even if the brat were at the same cultivation level as him, he still couldn't have been so powerful, unless he was a celestial king. However, did the duplicate moon sect have a second celestial king? Before he could finish this thought, he lost his consciousness forever. Ling Han didn't pay any heed to this as he continued to stride forward. To him, this was nothing more than a slight disturbance. After all, who had told that person to attack him without a single word? Lord Mio has been killed. Not good. Lord Mio has been killed. The camp instantly descended into chaos upon realizing that the man with the gray cap had been killed. They all ran around like headless chooks. A group of ascending origin tier elites charged over, wearing expressions of fury as they glared at Ling Han. However, none of them attacked. They hadn't noticed any signs of battle over here just then, yet the man with the gray hat had suddenly been killed. Was Ling Han too powerful? Thus, they naturally couldn't attack him recklessly. "Sir, who are you?" someone asked in a solemn voice. Ling Han ignored his question. He arrived at the face of the mountain, yet he didn't stop there. Instead, he continued to stride forward. The elites all sneered upon seeing this. This was a mine that the two powerful celestial kings had been fighting over for a long time. Why was this? This was because this mine contained precious metallic elements that could be extracted and refined into precious ores that were only inferior to divine metal. It was also because of this that the mountain here was unbelievably solid and sturdy. To say nothing of ascending origin tier cultivators, even celestial kings could only blast a small opening in the mountain with their full strength. Yet this person wanted to crash through the mountain just like that. What an utter fool! However, in the next instant, their eyes bulged out in deep shock. Like a steel ox entering water, Ling Han slowly pushed into the mountain. It wasn't that the mountain wall had become water, but rather that Ling Han was like an indestructible weapon that could brutally carve into the mountain. Shards of rock and dust continued to rain down. This was a sign of Ling Han's immense power. He had shattered the mountain wall with his brute strength. This was far too terrifying. He wasn't moving quickly at all, and he was simply striding forward at a leisurely pace. Yet he had still managed to cause such frightening destruction to the mountain. Just how explosive was his power? Everyone trembled upon seeing this. They naturally didn't dare to attack at this moment. After all, charging over would be seeking death. Ling Han had activated his body art, which was something tempered by the void particle energy, the fundamental power of the Genesis world. Even a small movement could unleash a devastating destructive power. Thus, he was able to easily crash through the mountain. He continued to stride forward at a leisurely pace. Others needed to expend a great deal of effort to mine this area, yet he could easily stroll around in a casual manner. When his body completely vanished into the mountain, the group of elites finally exhaled in relief. "What should we do?" they asked as they exchanged glances. They could all see the cold sweat on each other's foreheads. "There's no way we can stop this person, so we had better report this matter to the sect master." Someone immediately returned to the Red Flower sect to deliver this information. The Red Flower sect wasn't far from here, so it only took 2 days for the sect master of the Red Flower sect to appear at the mine. Even though the sect was called the Red Flower sect, the sect master wasn't actually a woman. Instead, it was a burly man who had a head of messy hair. He was also bare-chested. Who would have imagined at a glance that he was a calculating and scheming person? Who would have imagined that he had laid a trap that would take tens of millions of years to discover? Even though he was already aware of the situation, he was still astonished when he saw the cave carved out by Ling Han. The sect master of the Red Flower sect reached over and placed a hand on the mountain wall. Crumble. A large area of the mountain wall instantly transformed into sand that fell to the floor. "Sect master is so mighty!" The elites instantly exclaimed in delight upon seeing this. This greatly increased their morale. The sect master of the Red Flower sect also smiled faintly. However, his mind was filled with shock. Even though his attack had appeared casual, only he knew that he had expended a great deal of energy. However, according to his subordinates, that mysterious person hadn't unleashed a single attack at all. Instead, he had walked in head first, just like that. Even so, he had still caused the mountain wall to crumble. With such a comparison, the sect master immediately knew that his strength was far inferior. Where had the duplicate moon sect found such a formidable person? At this moment, he had thoughts of abandoning this mine. However, he was also unwilling to do this, especially since he had already schemed for so long. Moreover, was he going to give up without even seeing his opponent's face? At the very least, he would wait until Ling Han came out to make a decision. These thoughts raced through his mind. Meanwhile, Ling Han continued to casually stroll around the mine, searching for divine metal. In fact, this entire mountain was formed from origin metal, and it contained an astonishing amount of high-level precious metals. This was as expected of a high-level dimension. In the celestial realm, the next step down from divine metal was godly metal. There was no other transition metal, and one could only forge godly metal into pseudo-divine metal. Here, however, such transition metals existed, under a more powerful heaven and earth. The precious metals here were far superior in quality to godly metal. Thus, it was indeed possible for divine metal to exist here. Divine metal was naturally at the Celestial King tier, so it possessed a particular wavelength that Ling Han was currently scanning for. However, the precious metals greatly affected Ling Han's divine sense, so this severely limited the size of the area that he could scan. His progress wasn't quick, and the mountain was also far too large. Who knew where the divine metal was? Perhaps it didn't exist at all. However, Ling Han was unhurried as he continued to advance. This was divine metal, after all, something that all celestial kings dreamed of obtaining. If it could be obtained so easily, would it still be rare and coveted? Just as he was thinking this, he suddenly discovered a green, or that was as big as a fist. It was clearly extraordinary at first glance, and it exuded a dense, celestial chi. Perhaps even ascending origin tier elites wouldn't be able to near this ore, or else they would directly be obliterated by the powerful aura that surrounded it. Divine metal. Ling Han was astonished. He had just been thinking about the rarity of divine metal, and before he could even finish this thought, a piece had suddenly appeared before him. I should be ecstatic, right? Ling Han said with a laugh. He picked up the piece of divine metal. He didn't plan to feed this piece of divine metal to his divine demon sword, nor did he plan to forge it into a weapon. Instead, he was going to forge it into a spatial god tool. No, a spatial celestial tool. In terms of forging divine metal, unless it was a heavenly venerate, did they need to worry about destroying the divine metal? Ever since the Black Tower had fallen quiet, Ling Han had always been worried about how he would protect and hide those around him. This was because intense battles would damage spatial god tools. This caused him to be extremely anxious when he battled, and he was often unable to focus his full attention on his battles. This is truly a huge help. With a smile, he turned around to leave. Even though he could forcefully carve out another path to leave, that would consume his energy after all. So was there any need to do that? After a few hours, he exited the cave from the path that he had created. Ling Han instantly felt a powerful aura surge over. He involuntarily looked over, only to see a burly and messy second heaven celestial king, the sect master of the Red Flower sect. Ling Han's first reaction was an urge to laugh. However, he knew that it was disrespectful to laugh about other people's appearance, so he forcefully suppressed this urge. However, he still couldn't help but steal a few extra glances at the Celestial King. The other man truly brought shame to the title of Celestial King. The sect master of the Red Flower sect was also sizing up Ling Han. He became even more astounded. He clearly couldn't detect a formidable aura of regulations around Ling Han. This person was genuinely at the hidden radiant stage. However, this was simply impossible. In the next moment, his attention was instantly drawn to the green divine metal in Ling Han's hand. Give me back my divine metal. Chapter 2509, Forging a Spatial Celestial Tool. Chapter 2509, Forging a Spatial Celestial Tool. Ling Han faltered upon hearing this. Give him his divine metal back. His. He involuntarily laughed. He had already wanted to laugh because of the great contrast between this Celestial King's appearance and title, and after hearing this, he finally couldn't hold himself back anymore. He immediately spluttered with laughter. Oh, is your name written on it? The Red Flower sect's master humphed and said, This is the territory of my Red Flower sect, so no matter what you obtain here, it all belongs to my sect. You're going to be unreasonable then. Ling Han said in a leisurely voice. That's right, I'm going to be unreasonable. What are you going to do about it? The Red Flower sect's master humphed before waving his hand and saying, Into formation. Hundreds of ascending origin tier elites instantly started moving. A terrifying killing intent started to form. A smug expression involuntarily spread across the Red Flower sect's master's face. During the past few days, he hadn't been sitting around and waiting for Ling Han like a fool. Instead, he had made many preparations, with the most powerful one being this killing formation. In any other situation, which Celestial King would walk headfirst into such a formation. However, whom could Ling Han blame for letting others set a trap for himself? Ling Han had given the other Celestial King the opportunity to casually set up this formation. It was also because of this that his opponent was filled with confidence. Killing intent appeared in Ling Han's eyes. Oh, you want to kill me now? That's correct, the sect master of the Red Flower sect replied in a baleful voice. Celestial Kings were incredibly valuable, regardless of whether they were alive or dead. He had never planned to only obtain that piece of divine metal. Ling Han shook his head and said, "Well then, there's nothing more to say." "Indeed, there's nothing more to say. Go!" Whoosh! A burst of sword light swept over, its radiance illuminating the sky. Before the Red Flower sect's master could even finish the sentence, "Go die," his head had already been removed from his body by the vicious slash. Pum! Celestial king blood gushed into the air, triggering the grief of heaven and earth. Blood rain drizzled down. Ling Han sheathed his sword. With his current power and with the might of the divine demon sword, would killing a second heaven celestial king be a difficult task. The other elites from the Red Flower sect were still maintaining the killing formation. However, in the blink of an eye, their sect master had already been killed. This plunged them into shock and disbelief. They involuntarily stopped what they were doing. At this moment, a cold chill gripped their bodies. Should they continue to channel the killing formation? What an absolute joke! Even their sect master had been insta-killed. So what use would this killing formation be? Could it possibly defeat their opponent? Since they still hadn't attacked Ling Han yet, which gave them a chance at reprieve, they should seize this opportunity to immediately stop and surrender. The elites all fell to their knees, not daring to move another inch. Ling Han swept his gaze over them. However, he didn't massacre them. He had no time for this. He turned around and strode away. After arriving in some city, he paid a handsome sum to buy some information, asking about where he could smelt divine metal. After all, how could ordinary flames melt divine metal? He had to find a place that possessed raging origin flames. Many people took him for a fool, yet his offer of a handsome sum would naturally attract some knowledgeable people. In the end, he still managed to gather some information. He set off, spending 1 year traveling to a volcano that had already stopped erupting long ago. The earth fire here was incredibly terrifying, and it was definitely strong enough to smelt divine metal. Such powerful regulations of flames, Ling Han said with a nod. No wonder divine metal could be smelted here. If one dived into the earth fire, they would be refined into dust, even if they were a ninth heaven celestial king. Ling Han didn't waste any time, and he immediately started to refine the divine metal. This was only a crude billet that contained many impurities. Thus, he needed to purify it before he could forge it into a spatial celestial tool. Otherwise, its strength would be affected. He arrived next to the crater of the volcano. Using his mighty powers, he then extracted the earth fire to smelt the divine metal. This was a slow process. Even though the earth fire was devastatingly powerful, divine metal was divine metal after all. How could it be refined so easily? As Ling Han looked at the scorching earth flames that were dancing with symbols, he suddenly felt an urge to jump in and extract its magnificent power to temper his own body. However, he quickly suppressed this urge. After all, he wasn't divine metal. The latter was indestructible, so it would only change shape when burned by the raging flames. However, if Ling Han were refined, he would genuinely be killed. The temperature here was far too high, so even though Ling Han's physique could endure it, the other women couldn't. It was useless even if they stayed inside the spatial god tool. This was because the spatial god tool would directly melt if it neared the flames. Thus they all stayed outside. Ling Han spent most of his time refining the divine metal, but he would still find some time to spend with the women every few days. After all, this was an unfamiliar place, so it was necessary for him to be more cautious. He recovered his physique first, after which he activated the regulations of time to accelerate time for himself. This allowed him to refine the divine metal much quicker than before. 100 years passed, and a smile finally spread across Ling Han's face. He had finally succeeded in purifying the divine metal. It was slightly smaller than a fist, and he had forged it into the shape of a small box. Meanwhile, he had sealed the regulations of space within it, creating a small world. This small world wasn't large, and this was because Ling Han was still far from recovering his full grasp over the regulations of space. His severing mundane tier power was naturally limited. However, the wonderful thing about divine metal was its malleability. As long as his cultivation level increased, he could naturally continue to expand the space inside the spatial celestial tool. Ling Han left the volcano, placing all of the women into the spatial celestial tool. He then entered it himself. He still needed to transform this world into one that was habitable. Right now, it was sparse and empty. Ling Han moved numerous mountains and plains into it, and he also created several rivers and lakes. As things were now, he wouldn't consider adding a sea yet. After all, this world was still too small. He didn't need to specifically plant trees and flowers, either, since the mountains and plains that he had placed inside were already brimming with vegetation. Of course, there were also many animals and insects. Using his magnificent power, Ling Han also created a sun, a moon, and some stars, giving this world a cycle of day and night. He was extremely satisfied with his own handiwork. Even though the world still wasn't perfect, it possessed huge potential and boundless possibilities. In the future, he could change it as he pleased. Moreover, this was a precious tool that truly belonged to him. He didn't need to worry about it betraying him like the Black Tower had. It's time to head to the world's paramount martial academy. As Ling Han traveled, he didn't forget to cultivate in earnest. After 100 years in the volcano, he had finally reached the dividing soul tier. However, the higher one's cultivation, the slower one's progress naturally became. Even though he was a celestial king, the regulations in this realm were different and of a higher level. Thus, how could his progress be quick? If I want to return to the celestial king tier, that'll take at least another 10,000 years, right? Ling Han realized that even this might still be an optimistic estimate. However, one should naturally remain optimistic. After traveling for 7 years, Ling Han finally arrived near the world's paramount martial academy. The Flaming Frost Realm was a transcendent dimension, and it was also the most powerful dimension in the entire Genesis world. Its landmass was also humongous, and it was at least 100 times larger than the celestial realm. In fact, this was simply an estimation based on the information that Ling Han currently had. In reality, it was potentially even larger than this. The world's paramount martial academy was located atop Boundless Mountain. Right now, Ling Han was in a small village at the foot of Boundless Mountain, mulling over how he should enter the academy. Indeed, he was acquainted with Heavenly Venerate Zhou Heng. However, was this Heavenly Venerate not busy? Could he visit him as he pleased? Moreover, Ling Han didn't like disturbing others, either. He was indeed late because of his own matters. Thus, he wanted to resolve this himself. If the Martial Academy were still recruiting, he would enter with his own strength. Even though his cultivation appeared lowly at this moment, just how powerful was his body art? It was entirely possible for him to enter the Martial Academy based on this fact alone. He sipped wine in a tavern. No matter which dimension it was, this kind of place was always the best for gathering information. Brother, let's share a table. Chapter 2510, Marketplace. Chapter 2510, Marketplace. Ling Han looked up, only to see 2 men standing next to his table. They were both very young, yet they had already reached the ascending origin tier. They were fairly powerful. One of them wore a sword on his waist, and he smiled as he said, "The tavern is full, so is it okay if we sit here? As repayment, we'll bring you to the world's paramount martial academy for a look. How does that sound?" Before Ling Han could even reply, the 2 of them had already taken a seat. They then started to indulge in loud and empty talk, acting very familiar with Ling Han. One of them was called Su Chong, and the other was called Tang Chi. They were both planning to go to the world's paramount martial academy to become followers of the disciples there. Even though they would only be underlings, which of the disciples of the academy wasn't a supreme prodigy of a realm? Thus, becoming their followers would also bring huge benefits. Of course, becoming their followers was also extremely difficult and competitive. Brotherling, your cultivation is far too weak. None of the disciples will be willing to take you as their follower, Tang Chi said with a serious expression. He thought that Ling Han was the same as them. Ling Han shook his head and said, I'm not planning to become anyone's follower. This was the truth. He had never considered becoming a follower of anyone. Instead, he wanted to become a proper disciple. However, Su Chang and Tang Chi naturally wouldn't think this. Instead, they thought that Ling Han was a self-aware person who knew that he was too weak to become a follower. Anyhow, they were friendly and honest people. After several cups of alcohol, they patted their chests and promised that they would definitely allow Ling Han to see the world. Brother, whether or not you can become a follower is only a small matter. A marketplace has already formed here, and there are strange and bizarre things being sold every day, Su Chang said. If you're fortunate enough to uncover a gem, you'll have struck it rich. Ling Han smiled and said, Oh, then I need to have a look. Definitely. You have to realize that even the disciples of the academy go to the marketplace from time to time. If we're fortunate enough, we might even be fancied by one of them. At that time, won't we be soaring into the sky? Tang Chi said in excitement. After finishing their meal, they immediately set off for the marketplace. It wasn't long before they arrived. Sure enough, this place was a sea of people. In fact, this place was simply an expanse of empty land. However, many stands and booths had been set up, and they were more so lined up in a neat and orderly manner. Each row of stands measured hundreds of meters in length, and there were at least several hundred rows in total. Just how many stands and how many people were there? Each stand was crowded with several people looking through the goods. Exchanges here were largely completed using star stones. However, if one didn't have enough star stones, they could also use other items to pay. Of course, this was as long as both sides agreed. With Ling Han's current cultivation one, he could strike down a celestial body with a single punch. Thus, he still had some star stones, although not very many. However, while refining the divine metal in the volcano, he had picked up some fire element crystals that were extremely valuable to cultivators who practiced the great Tao of fire. He wandered around with Tang Chi and Su Chang looking through the stands. Tang Chi and Su Chang had already bought some items, yet Ling Han was still empty-handed. This wasn't because the items here were inferior in quality. Rather, it was because Ling Han's cultivation level was far too high. Thus, he naturally didn't care much for ordinary treasures. Only things such as divine metal could attract his attention. There were celestial medicines being sold here, yet not a single one had reached the celestial king tier. After all, who would sell such a valuable item here? Ling Han was slightly disappointed. However, he immediately accepted this fact. If a valuable item were so easy to find, would it still be left to him to buy? With this in mind, he immediately felt at ease. However, after walking around for 10 days, he was still completely empty-handed. Right at this moment, commotion suddenly erupted in the distance. What is it? What's going on? Tang Chi asked in curiosity. He stood on his tippy toes to peer into the distance. Only after a while did they learn that a disciple of the academy had come. It was because of this that commotion had erupted. Many people had rushed over to chum up to them, trying to win their approval and become their follower. It's Doka, Tang Chi said. I think he came over from the Shattered Army realm 9 million years ago. He's a monarch tier, and I heard that he advanced to the second heaven not long ago. It's a celestial king. TSK, TSK. Su Chang wore an expression of envy. Both he and Tang Chi were only king tiers, so it would be incredibly difficult for them to become celestial kings. Moreover, if it weren't for the fact that this was a transcendent dimension, it would be completely impossible for king tiers to become celestial kings based on their own effort alone. As Doka walked around, he continued to cause commotion among those in the surroundings. They all expressed their eagerness, and some stand owners even allowed him to choose some of their items for free. However, Doka didn't take any of their goods. He was a celestial king, so very few things could grab his attention. Ling Han retracted his gaze. There was no need for him to care about a measly monarch tear. He continued to scan the goods. After arriving at the next stand, he rested his gaze on a cauldron. This cauldron was extremely old and damaged, and it was more so covered in dust. If it were tossed on the street, it was very likely that no one would pick it up. Ling Han didn't notice anything strange about this cauldron. Instead, he was simply surprised that it had been put here for sale. It wasn't genuinely a broken cauldron, was it? He picked it up and examined it carefully. The stand owner was a middle-aged man, and he simply glanced at Ling Han without stopping him. He said, "I discovered this cauldron in an ancient tomb. It's extremely sturdy." Ling Han smiled and said, "Then can I give it a hard smack?" "Sure," the middle-aged man said with a nod. "Smack it as hard as you want. If you truly manage to break it, I won't ask for compensation." "All right then," Ling Han said with a nod. He then smacked the cauldron. There was a dull thud, yet the cauldron didn't vibrate at all. Interesting. Ling Han could sense that this cauldron hadn't been forged from divine metal. After all, divine metal possessed a peculiar aura that was similar to that of a celestial king. However, this cauldron seemed dull and lifeless, completely lacking the lively and noble aura of divine metal. Regardless, just its sturdiness alone was a sign of its extraordinary nature. "Can I use this as a pale refinement cauldron?" Ling Han mulled over this. Pale refinement cauldrons needed to be sturdy and immune to fire. Just as he was about to speak, commotion suddenly erupted again in front of them. "They've started fighting!" Tang Chi exclaimed in excitement. "It's Doka and Yang Jishuan." It seems like they both set their sights on an ancient item, yet neither side was willing to yield to the other. In the end, they started fighting. "Gasp! Yang Jishuan!" Su Chang said with a sharp inhale. "Yang Jishuan? Is he also a disciple?" Ling Han asked casually. No, he's not a disciple. He's only a follower." Tang Chi replied with a shake of his head. He wore a solemn expression. "Only a follower? What's so impressive about that?" "He's the follower of Lord Heavenborn." Su Chang added. Both his tone and expression were filled with respect and apprehension. Ling Han's heart involuntarily jolted. Heavenborn? Yang Jishuan is a celestial king himself, and he's more so a second heaven celestial king. No matter where he is, will he not be a renowned individual? However, he was still willing to become Lord Heavenborn's follower. Tang Chi said, chiming in where Su Chang left off. "You definitely can't underestimate Yang Jishuan. Of course, Lord Heavenborn is naturally even more terrifying than him. He was actually able to obtain a celestial king as a loyal follower," Shi Chang said in admiration. Indeed, celestial kings would be mighty elites no matter where they went. Yet, this person was actually willing to become someone's follower. This was definitely a huge piece of news that further highlighted the freakish power of Heavenborn. "I'm heading over to spectate the battle," the stand owner said, snatching the cauldron back from Ling Han. He then placed all of his items into a spatial god tool before immediately squeezing his way forward. Since this was the case, Ling Han also went over with the others to catch a glimpse of the battle. Chapter 2511 Reappearance of Battle Armor. Chapter 2511 Reappearance of Battle Armor. However, as Ling Han and the others ran forward, many more people were retreating, with their faces as pale as a sheet. This was because the two celestial kings had already started to clash. Most of the people here were at the ascending origin tier, while some of them hadn't even reached this level yet. Thus, just a small shock wave from this battle could end their lives. Fortunately, the two celestial kings quickly took their battle into the sky. Boom, boom, boom. Deafening thuds continued to travel over from the sky. Most people couldn't see the battle at all, and they could only tell that the battle was extremely intense. However, Ling Han could see everything clearly. Doka was a blond man with a hooked nose and sunken blue eyes. He was tall and sturdy, and he was extremely skilled with his legs. With a single kick, he could unleash the power of the regulations of water, triggering a boundless tidal surge. Meanwhile, Yang Jishuan had black hair and black eyes, and his figure wasn't especially sturdy. Instead, he was tall and slender, and he wore a cold and aloof expression. He continued to lash out with his palms, easily slicing apart the tidal waves unleashed by his opponent. He was completely unafraid of this disciple from the world's paramount martial academy. Both the celestial kings were extremely powerful, exchanging blow after blow. They both wanted to suppress their opponent. However, the fact that Doka was a proper disciple, while Yang Jishuan was only a follower, signified that there was indeed a gap in their aptitude. Doka was naturally more powerful. Thus, in a battle at the same cultivation level, it was naturally the person who was more talented who would achieve victory. This was without a doubt. Even though Doka had only just advanced to the second heaven, he was a monarch tier, so his vitality index had directly soared to 6,600. Meanwhile, even though Yang Jishuan had already reached the peak stage of the second heaven long ago, his vitality index was only around 6,500. Perhaps it was slightly higher than this, but it was definitely not as high as Doka's. After battling for several hours, it was clear that Yang Jishuan had fallen into a disadvantage. Yang Jishuan is about to lose, someone remarked calmly. This was one of the few people who could observe the battle in the sky. Their remark triggered many questions from those in the surroundings. After all, they couldn't see anything, and were simply here for the atmosphere. The person gave a brief description of the battle, and this caused many people to sigh with emotion. This is inevitable. After all, Lord Doka is a genuine disciple. Even though Lord Yang is also a celestial king, he's limited by his aptitude after all. Against someone at the same cultivation level, he can only do so much. Moreover, Lord Doka has only just advanced to the second heaven. Once he reaches the peak stage of the second heaven, Lord Yang will definitely be defeated within 100 exchanges. He's a monarch tier after all. How many of them exist in the entire world? Meanwhile, Ling Han was simply here to enjoy the show. He also nodded in his mind upon hearing everyone's remarks. Unless Yang Jishuan had some trump card, he would definitely suffer a brutal defeat. Whoa! There was a flash of purple, and it was as if another sun had materialized in the sky. Ling Han couldn't help but feel astonished. He had just thought about Yang Jishuan needing a trump card, and in the next moment, the other party had immediately unleashed a trump card. Right now, Yang Jishuan was covered in a suit of purple armor. However, this armor was far thicker and heavier than what Ling Han expected. Yang Jishuan was originally only half a head taller than most ordinary people, yet he was more than 3 meters tall right now. From this fact alone, one could imagine just how thick and sturdy his armor was. Ling Han was slightly astonished. Even though this suit of armor was extremely thick, it still appeared elegant and streamlined, with its surface polished and smooth. Moreover, it was decorated with numerous symbols that pulsated with the might of celestial kings. A thought suddenly flashed through Ling Han's mind. How unexpected! You actually possess a suit of battle? Armor 1. Doka's expression became solemn and serious. This type of armor was no ordinary armor. Instead, it was a powerful supportive tool produced by some dimension that had taken a scientific route of evolution. Battle armor was divided into several different tiers and types, with some targeting those at the Shattering Void tier, some targeting those at the Genesis tier, some targeting those at the Celestial King tier, and so on. When a Celestial King wore such armor, they could increase their battle prowess by a significant amount. An extremely significant amount. However, Celestial King tier battle armor was extremely expensive, and the cost of maintaining it was also exorbitant. Thus, it was extremely difficult for Celestial Kings to possess such armor. Upon wearing this battle armor, both the battle prowess and defensive ability of Yang Jishuan would soar to a new height. Perhaps he could rival or even surpass Doka. Of course, this was dependent on the battle armor's grade and also its affinity with Yang Jishuan. "There's still time for you to fuck off," Yang Jishuan said in a haughty manner. Even though Doka was a disciple and Yang Jishuan was only a follower, the Academy's rules stated that it wouldn't interfere as long as the cultivation levels of both parties were within 2 minor levels. Both sides could fight to their heart's content, as long as the battle didn't result in death. Thus, the Academy wouldn't interfere or punish him even if he smashed Doka into a pulp. Moreover, a proper disciple failing to defeat a measly follower? Would he have the face to complain to the Academy? Doka chuckled coldly. He had also experienced countless struggles and obstacles on his way to finally becoming a celestial king. If he retreated in the face of a challenge, would he still have the face to refer to himself as a monarch tier? "Trash who can only rely on external power! See how I dispose of you!" he roared as his aura of haughtiness also soared into the sky. Boom! The 2 powerful celestial kings clashed again. Yang Jishuan's battle armor shone with brilliance, and it was as if he had transformed into an orb of purple light. In fact, even his attacks were completely different from before. They carried a purple radiance that possessed an astonishing destructive ability. Ling Han involuntarily clicked his tongue in wonder. The Dark Inverse Realm also possessed battle armor, and it had even created a war soldier like Wally. It was extremely impressive. By the looks of it, this kind of dimension wasn't rare in the Genesis world. In fact, battle armor was quite common and prevalent, especially since it provided the user with impressive supportive capabilities. It could increase both one's offensive capability and defensive capability at the same time. Ling Han could see clearly, and it was obvious that this suit of battle armor hadn't been forged from divine metal. Instead, it was forged from something equivalent to the Celestial Realm's 9-star or 10-star pseudo-divine metal. It could endure several attacks from celestial kings, yet in the end, it would still be shattered. However, this purple battle armor surprisingly possessed a powerful regenerative ability. After receiving damage, it would immediately repair itself and become as good as new. It was as if it had never suffered any damage. This was a detestable quality that prevented Doka from threatening Yang Jishuan. Ling Han pondered over the ways to destroy this battle armor in his mind. Firstly, one could use formidable strength to directly obliterate it, not giving it the opportunity to regenerate. Secondly, one could slowly exhaust its power. Once the battle armor was exhausted of all its power, it naturally wouldn't be able to regenerate anymore. However, Doka didn't possess the power to directly obliterate the battle armor. Moreover, after wearing the battle armor, Yang Jishuan's battle prowess also became superior to his. So how could he possibly exhaust the battle armor's power? It wasn't long before Yang Jishuan gained the upper hand, completely suppressing Doka. Another hour passed, and Doka finally let out an enraged roar as he turned around to flee, leaving a brilliant trail of light in the sky. Yang Jishuan stood tall and proud. Even though he had relied on external power to defeat Doka, being able to defeat a proper disciple as a follower was already something to be proud of. This was an achievement of great glory. He put away his battle armor and descended to the ground, instantly winning countless gazes of respect and reverence. In this world, winners were grinners. Following the conclusion of the battle, the gathered cultivators naturally dispersed as well. Some returned to sell goods at their stands, while others continued to stroll around and look for things to buy. If there comes a day when I can also possess such cultivation and power, and when I can also engage in such an impressive battle before everyone, just how amazing will that be? Tang Chi said with emotion. His face was filled with yearning. Su Chong roared with laughter. You'll be the person who is defeated. Pay. Tang Chi spat upon hearing this. However, he quickly sighed with emotion again, saying, If I can become a celestial king, what does it matter even if I'm ruthlessly defeated before everyone? I still yearn to become one. Chapter 2512, Forceful Purchase. Chapter 2512, Forceful Purchase. To most people, the celestial king tier was in sight, but unreachable. Thus, it was every person's dream to reach this lofty height. Su Chang also wore an expression of yearning. He completely agreed with Tang Chi's words, so he didn't continue to tease his friend. Ling Han chuckled and said, "As long as you put in the effort, perhaps there'll be a sliver of hope. TSK, what cultivation level are you at? Yet you're actually trying to console us?" Su Chang and Tang Chi playfully chided. They both recovered back to their jovial selves. If Ling Han wanted to, he could give both of them a celestial king pill, allowing them to immediately become celestial kings. However, they would be forever stuck at this level, with no chance to ever grow stronger. Besides, he had left all of his celestial king pills in the celestial realm. Moreover, he wasn't that generous either. These two people were not yet his friends, and Ling Han was more so not a stupidly nice person. He involuntarily thought to himself, just how good would business be if he sold celestial king pills here? However, did a celestial path exist here? If a celestial path didn't exist, how would he obtain celestial seeds? If he couldn't obtain celestial seeds, how would he refine celestial king pills? Forget about it. There was no point thinking about this anymore. He returned to the stand that he had been at before, picking up the cauldron and asking, "What's the price for this item?" 100 million star stones, the middle-aged man said. At the same time, he even raised a single finger to stress his point. "You might as well rob someone." Tang Chi exclaimed in anger. This cauldron didn't exude any might, and what use was its stupid sturdiness? Perhaps they would use it to smack someone. If you want to buy it, then that's the price. I'm not forcing you to buy it, am I? The middle-aged man said with a chuckle. He turned his gaze away from Tang Chi, and it was as if he viewed him with complete disdain. "You're angering me to death." Tang Chi shouted. Ling Han didn't have so many star stones with him. He pondered for a moment before saying, "I don't have so many star stones on me. However, look at this item. Do you need it?" He retrieved a fire element crystal, handing it over to the middle-aged man. The man didn't take him seriously, and this was mainly because Ling Han's cultivation level was far too low. What valuable items could he possess? However, he immediately screamed in pain upon accepting the fire element crystal. In fact, he almost threw it away. It was hot, far too hot. "What are you doing? If you break it, can you afford the compensation?" Tang Chi chided. He immediately seized this opportunity to berate the middle-aged man. He then bent down to pick the crystal up. However, he involuntarily yelped upon picking it up. "Pah!" The crystal was dropped to the ground again. "PFF!" Su Chang burst into laughter. "Say, Brother Tang, is there any need to tease others like this? You even copied him dropping the item. This is Brother Ling's item. So how will you compensate him if you truly break it?" He bent down to pick the crystal up. However, he immediately exclaimed in astonishment upon touching the crystal. Even his face became green. It was far too hot. Was that still a crystal? It was clearly the essence of fire. The middle-aged man finally came to his senses. He wore a serious expression as he walked out from behind his stand. He reached over with his right hand, yet this time there was a layer of regulations around his hand. He then grabbed the crystal. An expression of wild delight instantly spread across his face. Is this a concentrated crystal of the regulations of fire? It possesses the terrifying great Tao of fire within it. If I obtain enough of such crystals, I might even be able to comprehend the complete great Tao of fire and advance to the celestial king tier. Tang Chi and Su Chang were both astonished upon hearing this. This scalding hot crystal was actually this impressive. They exchanged a glance before shaking their heads. One of them practiced the regulations of wood, while one of them practiced the regulations of earth. Both of these had nothing to do with the regulations of fire. Huh, you retrieved it with your hand just then. So why wasn't your hand burned? Tang Chi suddenly exclaimed. He was no fool, and he immediately noticed this problem. He looked at Ling Han in astonishment. Su Chong was also astounded. He hurriedly grabbed Ling Han's hand, spreading it open to observe. It was as smooth as jade. Where were the burn marks? How strange! He hurriedly grabbed Ling Han's other hand. However, it was also uninjured. Even the middle-aged man clicked his tongue in wonder. They had all examined the might of this crystal, and they discovered that it was difficult to hold it even with the power of regulations wrapped around their hands. They could still feel the devastating heat of the crystal, and it was only just barely manageable. With such a lowly cultivation, how had Ling Han managed to hold this crystal with no problems at all? Ling Han smiled and said, "Perhaps my skin is thick and tough." This was the blatant truth. His physique was at the second heaven. Moreover, this crystal had only been refined from the earth fire, so its might naturally wasn't comparable to that of origin fire. As such, he could handle it with ease. "How many of these crystals do you have?" the middle-aged man asked. He was extremely enticed by these crystals, so much so that he couldn't be bothered figuring out why Ling Han hadn't been burned. After all, many things in this world couldn't be explained. 10, Ling Han replied. He naturally possessed more than 10, but wasn't business all about haggling? He wasn't running a charity after all. The middle-aged man hesitated upon hearing this. He had found this cauldron in an ancient tomb that was most likely several epochs old. He knew this because he had asked someone to appraise some other items for him, allowing him to determine the age of the tomb. He was adamant that this cauldron was special, and it was because of this that he had priced it at 100 million starstones. However, he couldn't list any redeeming quality of this cauldron apart from its sturdy nature. As such, he didn't have the confidence to haggle. So be it, he would take 10 of these crystals. He didn't want to wait any longer. He gritted his teeth, nodding, and said, "All right, deal." Wait. Right at this moment, a large hand suddenly reached over, grabbing at the cauldron. While they were haggling just then, the middle-aged man had also taken the cauldron back. He was completely unprepared at this moment, and the cauldron was just about to be taken by that person. Pum! However, Ling Han suddenly launched a kick, striking the middle-aged man. A burst of power surged over, causing his body to involuntarily contort. At the same time, the cauldron just swung out of reach of the large hand. The person who had reached over was astonished. The middle-aged man had contorted in an extremely clever manner, actually causing him to miss. This was absolutely incredible. Lord Yang Zhishuan! Tang Chi and Su Chong both exclaimed in astonishment. The person who had interfered was actually Yang Zhishuan. Yang Zhishuan had also felt a sudden urge when he saw the cauldron. He also couldn't identify anything special about the cauldron, but since he had felt a sudden urge, he had to buy it to investigate no matter what. "Hand it over," he said in a deep voice, with his might as a celestial king booming through the surroundings. The middle-aged man involuntarily shuddered. "But, Lord, I've already sold the cauldron to him," he said as he pointed to Ling Han. He didn't give in after being frightened. He still maintained his integrity. Yang Zhishuan peered down at Ling Han, his eyes full of disdain. Such a measly person dared to compete with him? What a hilarious joke. He frowned and said, "How many star stones?" "I'll pay double." The middle-aged man hesitated upon hearing this. In reality, he was in greater need of the fire element crystals. After all, these crystals would give him a sliver of hope to reach the celestial king tier. Ling Han humphed and said, "If you had arrived earlier, you could have competed fairly, with the highest bidder obtaining the cauldron. However, we've already settled on a price and made a deal, yet you still insist on forcefully purchasing the item. You're showing such wanton disregard for the rules." Su Chong and Tang Chi instantly went pale upon hearing this. That was Yang Zhishuan, to say nothing of his identity as a follower of Heavenborn. He was still a mighty celestial king. In fact, he had just defeated a proper disciple who was a second heaven celestial king. If one talked back to him, one would definitely suffer a tragic end. Chapter 25:13 Tearing Apart a Battle Armor with Bare Hands Ed. Chapter 25:13 Tearing Apart a Battle Armor with Bare Hands. Yang Zhishuan also hadn't imagined that Ling Han would dare to talk back to him. He faltered for a brief moment before coming to his senses. However, he wasn't enraged. After all, did a mighty celestial king need to take the words of such a measly person to heart? He could simply end the conversation by smacking them to death, couldn't he? However, such naive youths were truly rare to come across. He was slightly intrigued, and he said, "Brat, do you not understand that might is right in this world? My cultivation is far superior to yours, so much so that I can squish you to death with a single finger. Are you not afraid?" Ling Han laughed as he raised his right hand, clenching it into a fist. "I can also smash you to death with a single punch. Do you believe me?" Yang Zhishuan faltered upon hearing this. He then burst into loud laughter. Where in the world had this naive youth come from? What an extremely fun person. It was because of this that he hadn't developed killing intent, either. However, a thought suddenly occurred to him, and he immediately summoned a sword that pierced at Ling Han. He simply wanted to make Ling Han suffer a little and teach him a lesson. Whoa! The tip of the sword immediately reached Ling Han's chest. Ling Han immediately lashed out. Pum! His fist smashed into the tip of the sword, instantly causing the sword to shatter. Before Yang Zhishuan could even react, Ling Han's fist continued to surge forward. Pum! The fist smashed into Yang Zhishuan's chin. A person instantly soared into the sky, quickly transforming into a small black dot. "What's going on?" someone asked. There were naturally spectators around them, and these people couldn't help but grimace. They all wore stupefied expressions. Where was Yang Zhishuan? Why had he suddenly run away? Even if they were beaten to death, they would still refuse to believe that he had been sent flying by Ling Han's punch. Even Su Chang and Tang Qi didn't believe this. With their vision, they naturally couldn't have seen the exchange anyway. After all, even Yang Zhishuan hadn't had the time to react. That being the case, how could measly ascending origin tier cultivators have hoped to catch Ling Han's movement? Thus, they all believed that Yang Zhishuan had left by himself. Perhaps something urgent had suddenly come up. TSK, this celestial king was truly a benevolent person. Even though he had left for an urgent matter, he could have still smacked Ling Han to death with a single palm. Killing him would have been as easy as killing a fly. However, he hadn't done that. Just how benevolent was he? How detestable! However, just as they were all praising him, a loud roar suddenly traveled over. Yang Zhishuan appeared before them again. He was striding through the air, and there was a clear lump on his chin. There was also blood seeping from the corners of his mouth, and when he opened it to speak, it was also clear that he had lost several teeth. What's going on? Perhaps Yang Zhishuan hurried away to fight someone else just then, but the battle was so quick that he's already finished? Anyhow, whom is he roaring at? Ling Han ignored him. He had initially wanted to smash Yang Zhishuan to death with a single punch. However, since Yang Zhishuan hadn't attacked him with killing intent, he also decided to show some mercy. He simply gave him a lesson. After all, there was indeed no great animosity between them. He retrieved another 9 fire element crystals and handed them to the middle-aged man. He then grabbed the cauldron and placed it in his spatial celestial tool. "I truly underestimated you. You're a wolf in sheep's clothing. Very well," Yang Zhishuan said in a baleful voice. He had truly been far too reckless. It was because of this that he had been struck by Ling Han. At the very least, this was what he believed. WH what? Everyone went numb with shock upon hearing this. Yang Zhishuan's wound had been caused by Ling Han? Otherwise, why had he said that? However, how was this possible? What was Ling Han's cultivation level? If he could send a celestial king flying with a single punch, wouldn't the entire cultivation system be upheaved? Only at this moment did Ling Han glance up at Yang Zhishuan, saying, "If you want to speak, then come down to speak. Do you not know that this is extremely disrespectful?" Yang Zhishuan was enraged upon hearing this. He was being disrespectful, and the punch just then was respectful. His expression was baleful, and he said, "Into the sky for a battle!" There were far too many passers-by here, so even though it would be fine to kill a few, wreaking too much havoc would definitely invite punishment from the higher-level celestial kings. Ling Han frowned and said, "You still haven't learned your lesson. Enough with the nonsense." Yang Zhishuan roared, "Pum!" Ling Han bent his knees and launched up using his explosive leg power, not relying on the power of regulations at all. Even though he was simply using brute strength, his speed was still astonishing. He couldn't fly using the power of regulations, since he only possessed the power of regulations at the dividing soul tier. As such, his flying speed would be as slow as a snail. If he fought like this, could he ever hope to hit his opponent? However, the speed of his jump was insane, and he arrived before Yang Zhishuan in a flash. He then threw another punch. Xiao! Yang Zhishuan was sent flying again. Boom! There was a deafening boom as Ling Han landed back on the ground. His violent landing created a huge crater, and it also unleashed a massive shockwave that sent the people in the surroundings sprawling. Everyone was transfixed with shock upon seeing this. Even though they hadn't seen the situation clearly, it was without a doubt that Yang Zhishuan had been sent flying again. Moreover, the culprit was none other than Ling Han. Gasp! Holy Mother of God! Su Chang and Tang Qi were both numb with shock. They were more so overcome with an indescribable feeling. Thinking back, they had still been referring to Ling Han as a friend and brother. In fact, they had even teased him before. However, as it turned out, Ling Han hadn't lied to them at all. They had actually been treated as equals while messing around with such a person. Who would believe this? Ah! Yang Zhishuan flew back again, with his face comprehensively ruined now. It was filled with blood, and he appeared both ferocious and disheveled. He stared daggers at Ling Han, and his eyes were filled with raging fury. This was utter humiliation. Utter humiliation. Just then, he had defeated Doka in battle, greatly elevating his reputation and standing. After all, he had defeated a proper disciple as a follower. Now, however, he had been sent flying twice by an unknown brat who wasn't even a celestial king. These were the great ups and downs of life. It was truly a stimulating spectacle. However, this second punch finally allowed him to recognize the strength of Ling Han. He couldn't have avoided these punches by simply being careful. He humphed as he summoned his battle armor again, completely covering himself up. This instantly filled him with confidence and self-belief. With the protection of the battle armor, he was already standing in a position of definite victory. "Do you dare to battle me?" he roared. Ling Han was like a delighted predator seeing his prey. He indeed wanted to test out the strength of this battle armor. He wanted to see how many of his punches it could withstand. Pum! He unleashed his explosive power again, shooting into the sky. Yang Zhishuan couldn't react at all, and a forceful fist had already slammed into his chest. Under the powerful force of the punch, the symbols on the battle armor all lit up, forming a layer of light on the surface of the armor. This layer of light was a powerful defensive mechanism. Indeed, this was the first defensive line of the battle armor. However, the formidable power of the punch instantly shattered this layer of light, ripping through its defenses. Meanwhile, the punch continued to surge forward. If time were slowed down 10,000-fold, one would be able to see the armor denting inward, forming a deep crater that was eventually unable to resist the stress. In the end, the armor completely collapsed and shattered. Just as Ling Han had predicted before, as long as one's power was formidable enough to surpass the limit of the battle armor's regenerative ability, they would be completely capable of destroying it with brute strength. Ling Han unleashed a roar as he swung both his fists. Like a piece of thin cloth, the battle armor was instantly torn to shreds. Like a weak and defenseless young girl, Yang Zhishuan stood there with his mouth wide agape, unable to make a single sound. Even though it was only his battle armor that had been torn apart, he felt as if it were his clothes that had been ripped off, completely exposing him to everyone. This was utterly humiliating. Beneath them, everyone was transfixed with utter shock. Tearing apart a suit of battle armor with his bare hands, could he refrain from being so violent? Chapter 2514, Change of Mind. Chapter 2514, Change of Mind. Just then, they had all been speculating about Ling Han's strength. After all, none of them had caught the instance when Ling Han had sent Yang Zhishuan flying. Now, however, the situation was completely different. They could all see the scenes in the sky clearly. Just how powerful was that suit of battle armor? Everyone was aware of this. After wearing it, Yang Zhishuan could even defeat Doka, someone he couldn't rival with his own strength. This battle armor wasn't a celestial tool, yet it was only slightly inferior to celestial tools. It was incredibly rare and valuable. But now, someone had brutally ripped it to shreds with their bare hands. Phut! 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 Who could believe this? This was like a scene out of a legendary tale. Even though they were witnessing it with their own eyes, they could still barely believe what they were seeing. After tearing the battle armor to shreds, Ling Han couldn't help but shake his head. He had overestimated this suit of battle armor. He had initially thought that it was very sturdy, but as it turned out, it was only so-so. It was only defensively powerful thanks to the symbols engraved on its surface, which allowed it to form a powerful defensive barrier of light. Of course, if one's strength couldn't suppress the battle armor by too much, it would indeed appear to be indestructible and invincible. Moreover, it could even regenerate itself. Ling Han smiled and said, "Should we continue this battle?" Yang Zhishuan instinctively shook his head. Even with the suit of battle armor, he had still been no match for Ling Han. Thus, what was the point of continuing the battle? Most importantly, Ling Han still appeared as if he were an extremely weak person. This contrast was far too great, and it was almost impossible to accept. Ling Han slowly descended from the sky. This wasn't on purpose. Rather, if he wanted to fly, he had to rely on the power of regulations. However, in terms of his mastery of the regulations, he was only at the dividing soul tier. Thus, this was the limit of his speed. Everyone was rendered speechless upon seeing this. No matter how they looked, Ling Han was only at the dividing soul tier. However, he had managed to defeat a mighty celestial king. Lord Ling, Tang Chi and Su Chang said in a reserved manner upon seeing Ling Han land as they walked over. This was a freakish person who could easily defeat a second heaven celestial king. Would they still dare to refer to Ling Han as a brother? Ling Han smiled in reply, yet he didn't say anything to console them. After all, his strength was indeed far superior to that of these two people. In a world where the hierarchy of power meant everything, it was indeed impossible for them to act as equals. It was fun hanging out with you guys. If you ever encounter any troubles in the future, you can come to the academy to find me, Ling Han said to them. Thank you, Lord. Tang Chi and Su Chang replied in delight, to say nothing of whether they could actually gain an audience with Ling Han in the future. Just the fact that he had said this in public before so many people was already enough. This would act as a warning for other people. If they dared to target Tang Chi and Su Chang, they might possibly incur Ling Han's wrath. Ling Han nodded in reply. After this battle, He was confident that the Martial Academy would definitely send someone over to meet him. He left the marketplace, returning to the small village. He would wait for the people from the Martial Academy here. Since he was free anyway, he decided to put on a disguise and visit the tavern again. Right now, he was still extremely unfamiliar with the Martial Academy. While sitting around in the tavern, he heard the spirited discussions of many people. If we're talking about the most powerful new disciple of the Martial Academy, that's got to be Hua Ferong, someone shouted after having one too many drinks. He was arguing with someone else. And he continued, according to rumors, she actually possesses an origin flame. Just this alone is already enough for her to crush celestial kings at the same level. Moreover, she's indescribably powerful to begin with, and I've heard that her evolution index is extremely close to 12. He was extremely loud, and his comments instantly caused the surrounding customers to reply with an "oh." Only a pitifully few people possessed an evolution index above 10, not to mention an evolution index of close to 12. I say, Ji Wuming is the most powerful, someone said in disagreement. In a short 1 million years, he's already soared from the first heaven to the third heaven. Who can compete with such progress? No, Lord Luan Xing is the most powerful. There's no reason for this, other than the fact that Lord Luan Xing is the most beautiful. Her beauty is unrivaled through the ages. Someone shouted. This viewpoint won the support of many people. Everyone nodded in agreement. Even those who supported Hua Ferong and Ji Wuming had to concede that she was indeed unbelievably beautiful. Ling Han smiled in his mind. His wife was indeed stunningly beautiful. Even he felt extremely smug about this. A grossly drunk person suddenly stood up and said, No, even though these people are all very powerful, which of them can rival Lord Heavenborn? The tavern instantly fell silent. That person's an absolute demon. Just because someone slandered him behind his back, he destroyed an entire city as revenge, someone said with a pale expression. But his talent is far too impressive. 2 heavenly venerates actually argued over the right to take him as a disciple. In fact, they even threw hands. Even as strong as Hua Ferong is, she's only at the 3rd heaven. However, Lord Heavenborn is already at the 5th heaven. His cultivation speed is unrivaled in all ages. No one can compare to him. His strength had already far exceeded those at the same generation as him. In fact, only the older generation of prodigies can compare to him. For example, AMU. There's also Kinyu. And Dushi. The others also chimed in with several names. Each one of these prodigies was powerful enough to make heaven and earth lose its luster. These people have already reached the peak stage of the 9 heaven long ago, and they're only a single step away from reaching the heavenly venerable tier. All they need is a suitable opportunity. Everyone nodded in agreement. Heavenborn's power was far superior to those at the same cultivation level as him. I've heard rumors that the same dimension also produced another prodigy. In fact, Lord Zhouheng even left a dimensional transfer seal for him. Since he's regarded with such importance, he can't be much weaker than Lord Heavenborn, right? Someone suddenly said. Ling Han's ears immediately perked up. Were they not talking about him? Upon hearing this, the others instantly clicked their tongues in wonder. Zhouheng was a 6th-tier heavenly venerate, almost belonging to the strongest echelon of elites. His every action would attract the gaze of others. I've heard that he's already dead, someone else said in disdain. I've also heard that. He was enemies with Lord Heavenborn, and in the end, he was slain by Lord Heavenborn. To become enemies with Lord Heavenborn, he deserved to die. If he's alive, 1 million years have already passed, so why has he still not appeared? He's already a dead person, so what does it matter how astonishingly prodigious he was? All of that is worthless. Many people shook their heads, expressing their extreme disdain for Ling Han. Ling Han was extremely displeased upon seeing this. These people had never seen him before, So how could they possibly know that he was incapable? Heavenborn was indeed very powerful, but that was because he was the embodiment of the celestial realm. His physique was astounding, and he had also been tempered by fundamental power before. Thus, his battle prowess was naturally terrifying. However, all of this was because of his incredible birth. Moreover, one had to realize that the celestial realm was only a low-level dimension. In fact, it was a super low-level dimension. Thus, even though it had cheated and created an embodiment of itself, the growth of this person would definitely have a limit. At most, he could only become a second-tier heavenly venerate due to his background. Afterward, he would need to rely on himself and his opportunities to advance any further. If Ling Han wanted to suppress Heavenborn, he would need to possess an upper hand in terms of cultivation level. After reaching the heavenly venerable tier, however, Heavenborn's advantage due to his physique would also vanish. This was because divine metal couldn't withstand the destructive power of heavenly venerates. Ling Han was extremely confident in himself. Moreover, he would also cultivate the indestructible heaven scroll diligently, fighting to raise his physique to the level of divine metal as well. At that time, he wouldn't suffer a disadvantage when facing off against Heavenborn again. At this moment, a thought suddenly occurred to him. Before cultivating the indestructible heaven scroll to a pinnacle level, he definitely couldn't reveal his true identity. Otherwise, what would he do if he came across Heavenborn? Perhaps he could only flee. However, he didn't want to be on the back foot. Thus, concealing his identity was most likely the best choice. He silently stood up and left, not returning to the inn. Instead, he strode away from the village, directly setting off for the world's paramount martial academy. Chapter 2515, 9 Deaths Formation. Chapter 2515, 9 Deaths Formation. Ling Han arrived before the martial academy. While chatting with Tang Chi and Su Chong before, he had learned that entering the martial academy was actually extremely simple. As long as one was powerful enough, they could enter the martial academy anytime they wanted. They only needed to do one thing past the 9 Deaths Formation. This formation sat at the gate of the martial academy, and as long as one managed to pass it, they would be able to enter the martial academy. At that time, someone would immediately come over to register them as a disciple of the martial academy. This formation was called the 9 Deaths Formation, and it consisted of 9 different levels in total, with each level being more difficult to pass than the previous. However, one only needed to pass the first level to enter the academy. There was no need to pass all 9 levels. It was said that the 9 Deaths Formation corresponded to the 9 heavens of the Celestial King tier. However, even 8th Heaven Celestial Kings wouldn't necessarily be able to pass the first level of the 9 Deaths Formation. Why was this? This was because, in the first level of the 9 Deaths Formation, one's cultivation level would be suppressed to the first heaven. Thus, an advantage in cultivation level would be completely useless here. The 9 Deaths Formation was extremely difficult to pass. Moreover, even though the Empress and the others had been brought over by Zhou Heng, they had still needed to challenge the 9 Deaths Formation. This was the rule of the Martial Academy. If one couldn't pass this formation, they wouldn't be able to enter the Martial Academy. This was because the Martial Academy wouldn't give disciples free pass tokens or similar things. Each time they entered the academy, they would need to challenge this formation. If one couldn't pass this formation with their own abilities, would they have the face to enter the Martial Academy? The time it took for each person to pass the 9 Deaths Formation also varied greatly. The quicker one was, the better their result naturally was. Thus, there was also a ranking attached to this formation. It was said that only the most brilliant individuals could make it onto this ranking. The 9 Deaths Formation had already existed for several epochs. Thus, it had already been challenged by countless prodigies, many of whom had created great legends and legacies. As a result, trying to push into the rankings at this moment would be as difficult as trying to ascend the heavens. After all, This was equivalent to competing against countless prodigies from countless dimensions through countless generations. Each day, there would be many people challenging the formation, dreaming of entering the world's paramount martial academy. Becoming a disciple of this martial academy would be the greatest confirmation of their talent and the greatest glory they could experience. A man walked over and asked Ling Han, "Little brother, are you also here to challenge the formation?" There was a single ribbon of iridescent light around him. He was clearly a first heaven celestial king, yet he was wearing an amiable smile and didn't appear haughty or arrogant at all. Ling Han nodded with a smile, replying, "Yes." The man was dressed in a green robe, and he looked to be around 30 years old. However, judging by his flame of life, he had already lived for at least several epochs. Thus, it wasn't demeaning for him to refer to Ling Han as little brother. The Celestial King was extremely astonished upon hearing this reply. This was because Ling Han didn't look like a Celestial King at all. Was he here to seek death? "Young friend, this is no place for you to muck around," another person said. This was a beautiful female Celestial King. Ling Han smiled and replied, "No worries, I know what I'm doing." "Ha. Everything will be fine as long as you know what you're doing," another Celestial King said. He was dressed in black, and he was exuding an extremely dark and cold aura. "Say, why are you people speaking so much nonsense with a young child?" A Celestial King with an extremely large head, yet extremely small body said. He wore an expression of impatience. "Just going off your courage alone. Little friend, follow big sister. I'll definitely protect you," the female Celestial King said with a smile. Her expression was seductive and alluring. Celestial Kings should have all possessed steel-strong willpowers. However, upon seeing the smile of this female Celestial King, the male Celestial Kings couldn't help but feel enticed. It was clear that she was skilled in the art of seduction and manipulation. Otherwise, she couldn't have wavered the Celestial Kings, no matter how beautiful she was. Ling Han smiled indifferently and said, "Sure." He entered the formation with the other Celestial Kings. Including him, there were 7 people in total. Of course, there were naturally Celestial Kings who had entered before them, and there would naturally be Celestial Kings who entered after them. The Martial Academy didn't care about how many times they challenged the formation. Even if someone failed 10,000 times, they could still become a disciple if they eventually passed the formation. Of course, if they had only passed due to luck, they would most likely fail to re-enter the Martial Academy if they ever went out. At that time, it would be extremely embarrassing and awkward. After entering the formation, the surroundings still appeared the same as before. It was as if the formation didn't exist at all, and everything was only a lie. However, the 6 Celestial Kings didn't dare to let their guard down at all. They had already challenged this formation several times, so they naturally understood it very well, even though the formation would change slightly every time. Ling Han secretly observed his own body, discovering that there was no restriction placed upon him. His state was the same as before. According to rumors, one would have the chance to pass this formation as long as they were a first heaven Celestial King. However, regardless of how freakish a first heaven Celestial King was, their battle prowess could only reach the peak stage of the 3rd heaven at a maximum. Thus, with Ling Han's current strength at the 5th heaven, would he not be able to pass this formation with ease? Because of this, he was extremely calm at this moment. If he still couldn't pass this formation with such strength, would there still be reason in this world? He clasped his hands behind his back, appearing as relaxed as could be. "Humph, brat, even though friend Plum Blossom is willing to help you, this doesn't mean that you're outstanding or whatnot. Quit pretending to be so relaxed and calm," the Celestial King in black said in a cold voice. It was clear that he was slightly displeased. "Fuck!" They were moving around in such a cautious manner, yet Ling Han appeared as if he were taking a leisurely stroll. Was he treating them as bodyguards? They were bringing him over to expand his horizons, so he also had to fix up his attitude, no. The female Celestial King glared at the Celestial King in Black and said, "Why are you arguing with a child?" She was the Plum Blossom Celestial King, and her beauty and fame were known far and wide. Countless Celestial Kings were trying to win her heart. The Celestial King in Black shut his mouth. However, there was a glimmer of killing intent in his eyes as he glanced at Ling Han. Ling Han indeed hadn't offended him. Whose fault was it that he was taking offense for no reason? Anyhow, finding an opportunity to kill Ling Han here would be far too easy. The latter had yet to reach the Celestial King tier, so killing him would be as easy as squashing an ant. "Be careful, it's about to begin," the Celestial King in Green said. "Ahem." Everyone nodded in acknowledgement. Even though the situation would be slightly different every time, the challenge would always begin around this area. The first battle was about to begin. Sure enough, after taking another step, 7 people suddenly appeared before them. Looking closely, these were 7 wooden puppets. They had no eyes, no ears, and no nose. Their bodies were also filled with symbols that radiated with overwhelming pressure. Wooden puppets could battle against Celestial Kings. Ling Han looked toward the Celestial Kings, only to see that their expressions were still calm. It was clear that this first wave of enemies wasn't powerful enough to trouble them. The battle began. Sure enough, the 7 wooden puppets all targeted a single person each. However, the 6 Celestial Kings teamed up to block all 7 of them. Without needing Ling Han to help, the 6 Celestial Kings quickly concluded the battle. Ling Han found this strange. If cooperation was allowed, wouldn't it be possible for powerful cultivators to bring weaker cultivators through the formation? After all, the Martial Academy had no rule against such cooperation. There was most likely some other mechanism to deal with this. They continued to push forward. The 6 Celestial Kings were extremely powerful when they teamed up, and they continued to brush through all challenges that they came across, not suffering a disadvantage even though they had to fight against 7 opponents. It wasn't long before they arrived in front of a foggy area. They all came to a halt. "Little friend, it's time for you to return," the Plum Blossom Celestial King said with a smile. "After entering here, each person has to fight for themselves, and it's impossible to help others. So your adventure ends here." Ling Han simply replied with a smile. He naturally couldn't turn around and leave. Moreover, as it turned out, the true test only began here. "Let's go," the Celestial King in Green said, stepping forward to enter the fog. They had only been willing to bring Ling Han over for this adventure because of a sudden impulse. However, they naturally didn't view him with much importance. The Celestial Kings entered the fog one by one, immediately vanishing from sight. Ling Han was just about to step forward, yet he unexpectedly saw someone walking back out from the fog. It was the Celestial King in Black. There was killing intent on his face, and he didn't speak a single word as he swung his palm at Ling Han, aiming to kill this detestable insect. Chapter 2516, Killed with a Single Punch. Chapter 2516, Killed with a Single Punch. Pung! The palm swung over, triggering power fluctuations of the regulations. The Celestial King in Black was just about to turn around and re-enter the fog, yet his eyes suddenly bulged out. Had he seen a ghost? Ling Han was still standing there, safe and sound. In fact, he even cracked a grin, although this grin didn't make the man feel any sense of friendliness. Instead, he felt as if his head were about to explode in fear. How is this possible? "So you've been concealing your strength," the Celestial King in Black exclaimed, immediately coming to a realization. Being able to block his attack was a clear sign that Ling Han's strength had definitely reached the Celestial King tier. Thus, regardless of whether he looked like a Celestial King or not, there was no doubt that he was indeed a Celestial King. Otherwise, his reaction would have been impossible. Ling Han smiled and said, "Did I offend you? Why do you insist on killing me?" "Humph, you're clearly a Celestial King, yet you're still being so pretentious and purposely obscure. Your intentions deserve death." The Celestial King in Black said in a baleful voice. Even if Ling Han were a ninth heaven celestial king, he would still be unafraid. This was because the 9 deaths formation would suppress everyone's cultivation level to the first heaven. Here, everyone was a first heaven celestial king. As such, what did he have to fear? Ling Han laughed and said, "Your words put me at ease. Now I can kill you without feeling any guilt at all. See, I'm a fairly friendly and kind person, aren't I? Unlike you, not only are your clothes black, but even your heart is as black as charcoal." The expression of the celestial king in black instantly fell dark. Just how proper and solemn were celestial kings? Yet Ling Han actually dared to taunt him like this? How immature! He didn't speak another word. Instead, he simply stared at Ling Han with killing intent. He would simply kill this person. There was zero need for so much drivel. Die. He immediately lashed out. Boom! His large hand transformed into a black sun that radiated with a scorching heat that could easily melt high-level, pseudo-divine metal. This was the lunar fire essence. Ling Han was astonished. This lunar fire essence couldn't be refined by any random person. Instead, it could only be refined by those who had a deep understanding and comprehension of the great Tao of fire. In his view, only monarch tiers and above could possibly refine lunar fire essence. However, would a monarch tier be unable to pass the 9 deaths formation and enter the martial academy? You didn't refine this yourself, did you? Ling Han asked. As he said this, he casually threw a punch. Pum! The black sun was instantly obliterated, unable to withstand the might of his punch. The celestial king in black was shocked. Not only had his ultimate attack been blocked, but even his secret had been exposed. The lunar fire essence, indeed, hadn't been refined by him. Instead, he had extracted it from bones that he had found in the tomb of an ancient celestial king. However, as a mighty celestial king, he was actually using power that he had obtained from a corpse. Now that he had been exposed by Ling Han, he involuntarily felt a sense of shame and anger. This was even though Ling Han didn't know where exactly he had obtained this lunar fire essence from. He then felt a cold chill run down his spine. Just how devastatingly powerful was the lunar fire essence. Even he didn't dare to come into contact with it. This was naturally because it hadn't been refined by him, so he was only using it as a precious tool. He would only release it when he needed it. He trembled in fear. To unleash such might, just how insane was his opponent's battle prowess? A thought suddenly occurred to the celestial king in black, and he stammered, "Why, you're the person who defeated Yang Zhishuan with a single punch before!" When news of this had spread, it had caused a huge commotion and argument, with most people adamant that this was only a baseless rumor. After all, how could a person below the celestial king tier achieve such a feat? Now, however, he had also come across an equally freakish person whose cultivation level clearly appeared lowly. Yet his strength was as domineering as could be. Ling Han smiled and said, "Your guess is correct. Now, why don't you take another guess? Will I spare you or not?" If this person hadn't especially come out from the fog to kill Ling Han, the latter would have also ignored such a minor character. However, not only had the celestial king in black revealed killing intent toward Ling Han, but he had even acted on this intent. Thus, Ling Han naturally wouldn't show any mercy. This was a completely different situation from the one with Yang Zhishuan. A thought occurred to the celestial king in black, and he suddenly turned around to flee. He charged into the fog. This fog had a powerful ability to separate people. So even if 2 powerful celestial kings walked into it hand in hand, they would still be gradually separated without them noticing. They could only challenge the formation using their own strength. Thus, once he entered the fog, he would reach absolute safety. In the future, he would also flee far away from this place, avoiding this murderous person forever. "Heh, can you flee?" Ling Han said with a soft chuckle. He bent his knees before unleashing an explosive burst of power. Pum! His speed was terrifying as he caught up to the Celestial King in Black in a flash, throwing a punch at his back. The Celestial King in Black was petrified to death. He hurriedly channeled all of his power to his back, aiming to block this strike. At the same time, he would also borrow its momentum to charge into the depths of the fog. This was his only way to survive. Pum! The punch landed, and the Celestial King in Black's defense was instantly ripped apart as if it were wet paper. Like a hot knife through butter, the punch then ripped through the Celestial King's body, eventually protruding out the front of his chest. The Celestial King in Black was still running, yet he suddenly discovered that his power was rapidly draining away. His expression was dazed as he stared at the fist that had suddenly appeared before his chest. His eyes dimmed and his head drooped. He was dead. Boom! Blood rain fell from the sky. Ling Han casually tossed the corpse of the Celestial King aside. However, he didn't forget to search his body. After all, there was no reason to abandon his spoils of battle. Without a second glance, he strode into the fog. This wasn't the first Celestial King that he had killed, so there was no need to think much about it. Brother Lin, what do you think about this brat? Inside the Martial Academy, two young men were currently enjoying a game of Go. There were no ribbons of iridescent light around them, and it was as if they were ordinary people. However, their eyes were incredibly sharp and intense, and even heaven and earth would tremble under their gaze. Brother Lin smiled faintly and replied, "This brat has experienced a greatly fortunate encounter. He's clearly at the third heaven, yet he's already been tempered by fundamental power. His battle prowess is simply astonishing. However, he's no well-behaved person. He's already started killing people immediately upon arriving," the other man said with a smile. "This person was brought over by your junior brother Zhou, so in the future he's also going to become a disciple under Lord Lin. The power of your branch is truly going to defy the heavens." He performed some calculations with his fingers, continuing, "Your esteemed master is a 7th tier heavenly venerate, and Brother Lin is a 6th tier heavenly venerate. Brother Zhou Heng and Brother Chu are also 6th tier heavenly venerates. Counting this brat, your branch will have 5 heavenly venerates, with each having the potential to reach the 7th tier. Brother Lin laughed heartily. However, he shook his head and said, "Even though Junior Brother Zhou, Junior Brother Chu, and I are all at the 6th tier, trying to advance to the 7th tier will be as difficult as trying to ascend the heavens. In terms of this brat, he's indeed got a good background and foundation, so it won't be difficult for him to become a heavenly venerate. However, whether or not he can reach the 6th tier or even 7th tier is up to his fortunes." The other man nodded in agreement. Becoming a heavenly venerate wasn't dependent on talent alone. It would also be affected by countless other complicated matters. If someone heard this conversation, they would definitely be shocked to the core. This was because their words revealed that they were heavenly venerates. Moreover, one of them was a paramount 6th tier heavenly venerate. Indeed, this Brother Lin was none other than Lin Xiaoyang, son of the 7th tier heavenly venerate Lin Luo. Meanwhile, the other person was Fu Yueyin. Both of them were 6th tier heavenly venerates. However, I still admire Brother Lin the most. Fu Yueyin said with a smile, "Brother Lin's cultivation talent isn't outstanding, and in the past you even lagged far behind your 2 senior brothers. Now, however, you've already caught up to them. In fact, you might even advance to the 7th tier before them." Lin Xiaoyang shook his head with a smile, saying, "That's all thanks to the hard work of my father." Meanwhile, Junior Brother Zhou and Junior Brother Chu are genuinely accumulating their cultivation for the future. Once they release it, their accomplishments will be no less than that of my father. As for me, the 6th tier is most likely my limit. Chapter 2517. Remarks by Heavenly Venerates. Chapter 2517. Remarks by Heavenly Venerates. Brother Lin, We truly don't need to worry about this brat. Fu Yueyun asked, changing the topic back to Ling Han. Lin Xiaoyang smiled faintly as he placed down a stone. He then said that brat has strong opinions, and junior brother Zhou has already said that we simply need to give him space to grow. There's no need to worry about him. All right then, Fu Yueyin said with a nod. He then continued, I've set my eyes on that fire girl, and I'm planning to take her as my disciple. You guys won't try to compete with me again, right? Lin Xiaoyang involuntarily laughed, saying, No, definitely not. Fu Yueyin nodded in satisfaction upon hearing this. He then placed a stone in reply. Lin Xiaoyang was slightly curious as he asked, Brother Fu, why didn't you choose Heavenborn? Fu Yueyin shook his head and replied, At the current stage, Heavenborn is indeed more outstanding. However, he's the culmination and embodiment of a dimension's willpower and essence. Even though he has a huge advantage in this sense, I predict that the third tier will be his limit. Moreover, that will be after heaven knows how many hundreds of epochs. Lin Xiaoyang raised his thumb, praising, Brother Fu is truly thorough in analysis. My father also remarked the same thing about this person. Moreover, he has a violent and ruthless personality, so who knows how many troubles he'll end up causing. Sai, this is a rare chance to rest in peace for a few days. In a while, we'll have to leave the dimension to battle with hysteria again. I truly relish these peaceful days, Fu Yueyin said with a sigh. Lin Xiaoyang smiled faintly and said, Brother Fu, there'll eventually come a day when we dispose of hysteria and return to our respective homes. At that time, it'll be difficult for us to meet again. Right now, in order to face hysteria, the elites from countless dimensions were gathered here. However, once hysteria was defeated, everyone would naturally return to their own dimension. As such, it would naturally be difficult for them to meet again. I dearly wish that this brat is, as Brother Zhou says, becoming a main force in the victory against hysteria in the future, Fu Yueyin said as he gazed into the distance. It was as if his gaze could pierce through all matter as he observed Ling Han, who was currently challenging the Nine Deaths formation. Lin Xiaoyang smiled faintly as he pinched a stone in his fingers. He had always been an optimistic person. Ling Han suddenly shivered, feeling as if he had been observed by some devastatingly powerful being. However, as he looked around, all he could see were layers of dense fog. He saw nothing else. Was it just my imagination? He shook his head. There were definitely heavenly venerates in the martial academy, so perhaps there had been a heavenly venerate observing him just then. With their paramount power, how could the Nine Deaths formation possibly block their vision? Ling Han strode forward. Whoosh! Clouds and mist gathered before him, transforming into a leopard that viciously lunged at him. Pum! He obliterated it with a single punch. Its vitality index was around 5,600. That's indeed powerful enough to trouble ordinary celestial kings. In fact, ordinary celestial kings were already emperor tiers. After reaching the peak stage of the first heaven, their vitality index would reach around 5,600. Now that the formation was producing such types of opponents, it was no wonder that most celestial kings would face a great deal of trouble. After all, monarch tiers were pitifully few in number. Ling Han continued to advance. Meanwhile, the formation also continued to produce opponents to face him. Sometimes there would only be a single opponent, while at other times there might be 2 or even 3 opponents. This would greatly trouble most ordinary celestial kings. In fact, it might even force them to flee. However, Ling Han could easily defeat all of them with a single punch. It didn't take him long to exit the land of fog. What appeared before him was a city. This city wasn't large, yet it was surrounded by a wall. Moreover, the city gates were also closed. On the 2 sides of the city were mountains that towered into the clouds, forming a canyon that the city sat in. In fact, the city was the checkpoint that blocked this path. If one wanted to continue forward, they would have to pass this city first. Ling Han didn't find the sudden appearance of this city strange, nor was he astonished by the appearance of the towering mountains. After all, he was inside a formation, so he wouldn't be shocked even if stars and the core of the world appeared. He arrived before the city gates, only to see that it was filled with messy scrawls and symbols. However, even though they appeared messy at first sight, upon closer analysis, these symbols immediately appeared in his mind. It was as if he didn't need to remember them at all. The symbols flashed chaotically, giving him a headache. The city gates were tightly shut, and they were also decorated with a messy scrawl of symbols. It was evident that if one wanted to open the gates and enter the city, they would need to rearrange these symbols into some kind of specific character first. This was the next test. However, Ling Han wanted to try another method. He took a deep breath and bent his knees slightly. He then suddenly unleashed his power. Pum! He immediately soared up, aiming to directly jump over the city. Crack! Devastating arcs of lightning flashed chaotically, directly striking Ling Han from the sky and smashing him into the ground. Ow, that hurt! Ling Han bared his teeth in pain. Even with his astonishing physique, he still felt bone-crunching pain after being struck by the lightning. Sure enough, this city couldn't be bypassed with such ease. Then what about the city gates? He immediately threw a punch. Pum! The city gates remained unmoving. However, the shock of the punch caused his entire arm to ache. At this moment, Ling Han had no option but to solve the problem as required. He retreated several steps before looking up at the city gates. Even though the symbols had all appeared in his mind just then, they wouldn't remain there for too long. Thus, he had already forgotten all of them. This was extremely strange. Sha! There was the soft sound of footsteps, causing Ling Han to turn around. He saw the Celestial King in green dashing out from the fog. He had initially been composed and graceful, yet right now his clothes were ripped and his body was riddled with wounds. He appeared extremely disheveled. However, when he saw Ling Han, his expression was as if he had seen a ghost. He had truly seen a ghost. Otherwise, how could this brat appear here? Moreover, he was even quicker than him. The Celestial King in green was absolutely stupefied, with his mouth slightly agape. Even though Celestial Kings were calm and composed, unblinking even if the heavens collapsed before them, he couldn't help but lose all of his composure at this moment. In fact, he was on the verge of spitting his tongue out in shock. This was far too strange. This was absolutely inconceivable. Huh, so Brother Green was still first, someone said with a strange laugh. Ling Han looked over, only to see the Celestial King with the large head and small body making his way out of the fog. He fared no better, with his body drenched in blood. However, he was still burning with fighting spirit. Pooh! However, he instantly spluttered in shock upon seeing Ling Han. He wore a dumbfounded expression. Ah, so as it turns out, I'm third, the Plum Blossom Celestial King said as she appeared. Her clothes were also slightly tattered, revealing some of her alluring and snow-white skin. A thought suddenly occurred to Ling Han. These Celestial Kings always challenged this formation together, but this wasn't to see the Plum Blossom Celestial King in her current state, was it? Pooh! The Plum Blossom Celestial King also spluttered in shock as she stared at Ling Han with a dazed expression. Afterward, the remaining two Celestial Kings also walked out from the fog one after the other. They also wore stupefied expressions when they saw Ling Han. In fact, the 5 Celestial Kings were all sharing the same thought at this moment they had seen a ghost. Ling Han waved and said, "We meet again." The 5 Celestial Kings felt as if they were in a dream. Even though Ling Han was standing right before them, they were still unable to accept and believe this. "Friend, so you've actually concealed your power this well," the Celestial King in green finally said. His voice was filled with emotion and realization. He was the first to be shocked, so he was naturally also the first to come to his senses. There was no other possibility. Ling Han had definitely been hiding his strength. His true cultivation was definitely at the Celestial King tier. "Ha! So we were all fooled," the Celestial King with the large head said. There was slight displeasure in his voice. This person was clearly a Celestial King, yet he purposefully acted like an amateur. Was he trying to toy with them? "Huh, where's friend Ran?" the Plum Blossom Celestial King asked as she looked around. Quite a while had passed, so why hadn't he appeared yet? The 6 of them had already challenged this formation together many times. The gap between them in strength was small, and it was usually the Celestial King in green who would reach this area first. Meanwhile, the Celestial King in black would be the 4th to reach this area. Now, however, to say nothing of arriving 4th, he still hadn't arrived even though the 5th person had already arrived long ago. Where was he? Could it be? The 5 Celestial Kings looked toward Ling Han in unison. Chapter 2518, Passing the Formation. Chapter 2518, Passing the Formation. The Celestial King in black had harbored no positive feelings toward Ling Han. Everyone knew this. Now, Ling Han had appeared here, while the Celestial King in black was nowhere to be seen. What did this signify? The Celestial King in black had been killed. Gasp! If this were true, the information that it revealed was far too terrifying. Firstly, it was extremely difficult for Celestial Kings to kill fellow Celestial Kings. This was recognized by everyone. As long as the gap in cultivation level wasn't large, a Celestial King wouldn't be able to stop another Celestial King from fleeing. Secondly, how long had passed? Yet a Celestial King had already been killed. To kill the Celestial King in black with such ease, just how overwhelming did Ling Han's battle prowess need to be? He had killed him in such a short amount of time, and he had more so stopped him from fleeing. With these thoughts in mind, the Celestial Kings couldn't help but feel uneasy. They were filled with apprehension. Ling Han simply replied with a smile. He didn't explain anything. He continued to gaze at the city gates before him, with the shards of the symbols floating around his mind. He attempted to piece them together. Strangely, however, no matter how hard he tried to commit these symbols to memory, they would slowly fade away with the passing of time. After just 2 hours, they completely vanished from his mind. He couldn't recall them no matter what. Friend, this stage is about trying to piece some words together. You have to rearrange these shards into the correct words within a limited amount of time. If you're correct, you'll be invited into the city, the Plum Blossom Celestial King said. Ling Han grumbled in his mind. Who had come up with this stupid test? He nodded at the Plum Blossom Celestial King, expressing his thanks. The other Celestial Kings humphed in their minds upon seeing this. They were slightly displeased. Ling Han looked at the city gates again. Meanwhile, the Plum Blossom and the others also did the same thing, with all of them mulling over the shards. The words and symbols would change all the time, so it would be useless even if they had passed this stage before. They would still have to challenge it again. As such, it was also impossible to rely on fortune. Ling Han focused his full attention on the task this time. When the shards appeared in his mind, he didn't try to immediately piece them together. Instead, he started to analyze them first. After all, different words would definitely have slight differences. Sure enough, it wasn't long before he separated these shards into 20 different groups. He then multitasked, rearranging these 20 words at once. With his powerful divine sense, this was naturally no difficult task. A short while later, the 20 words lit up in unison. Very well, you have solved the puzzle. You now have the right to enter the city. Don't be too arrogant. Ling Han read this in his mind. Whoosh! A sheet of light swept over, immediately drawing him into the city. Pooh! The 5 Celestial Kings violently spluttered again. Their eyes were wide with shock and disbelief. He had solved the puzzle that quickly. His achievements will definitely be limitless, the Celestial King in green said with emotion. The Plum Blossom Celestial King suddenly faltered before saying, I've heard that Yang Jishuan was defeated by a mysterious person before. In fact, this person ripped his battle armor apart with his bare hands. However, he hadn't even reached the Celestial King tier yet. Before, I merely thought that this was a rumor. Now, however, it's that brat, the 4 Celestial Kings exclaimed in unison. With a shudder, Ling Han had already appeared in the city. However, this city was empty and desolate, with not a single person in sight. It was filled with a sense of gloominess and eeriness. However, Ling Han was unafraid as he strode forward. Tap, tap, tap. Footsteps traveled over from in front of him, after which 2 figures appeared. They were both around 6 meters in height, and they both radiated with the luster of metal. Ling Han was slightly astonished. These were war soldiers. Crackle! The 2 war soldiers attacked in unison, shooting beams of red light from their eyes. These beams of light swept toward Ling Han. Ling Han raised his hand to block the attacks, with the 4 beams of red light all landing on his hand. It burns! Ling Han was astonished. This wasn't the regulations of fire. Instead, it was a type of violent and chaotic energy that could cause even him to feel a burning sensation. This was simply incredible. It was no wonder that the foreign realm was feeling immense pressure from the dark inverse realm. In fact, they had even been forced to create a battle beast such as Little Terror. This was because of the overwhelming power of war soldiers. Moreover, unlike celestial kings, these war soldiers could be mass-produced. Once they reached a certain number, they would indeed become terrifying. Explode! Ling Han roared. Boom! His voice transformed into a shock wave. Pung, pung! The 2 war soldiers were instantly blasted into smithereens, unable to withstand his crushing 5th heaven battle prowess. Ling Han continued to crush all opponents in his way, quickly making it out of the city. What appeared before him was a large river. Again, he was unable to fly across this river. There was some kind of mysterious power in the air that would strike him down with thunder if he attempted to. Meanwhile, numerous rocks would float to the surface of the river from time to time. However, there was seemingly no pattern to when they appeared or disappeared. Ling Han understood that he needed to cross the river by using these stones as platforms. The length of my strides will clearly be limited as well. Anyhow, let me have a try first, Ling Han said to himself. He jumped onto the first stone. Unleashing his full power, he then leaped toward another. Plop! He immediately fell into the water. With a boom, the roaring river directly washed him downstream. It took him 15 minutes to run back to the starting point. It was clear that there was no limit on how many times he could fail. However, if one wanted to make it onto the ranking list with the other supreme prodigies, they naturally couldn't fail even once. Ling Han stood still, observing the changes in the stones and analyzing the patterns of their appearance. After one day, he finally stepped forward again. Xiao, xiao, xiao! He leaped across the stones, crossing the river in a single breath. He glanced back before continuing to advance. A short while later, a gate appeared before him. This wasn't another test. Instead, this was the gate of the world's paramount martial academy. He had passed the 9 Deaths formation, or rather its first level. A person flew out from the gate. It was a middle-aged man who had 3 ribbons of iridescent light around him. He looked at Ling Han and said, "Congratulations on passing the 9 Deaths formation. From now on, you're a proper disciple of the academy. Dare I ask for your name?" Ling Han pondered for a brief moment before replying, "Zhang San." The middle-aged man's expression involuntarily froze. "Even if you don't want to reveal your identity, can you please put in some effort and think of a more normal name? It doesn't require that much brain juice, does it? Is it really all right for you to act like this?" "Friend ZH Zhang San, Do you want to challenge the second level of the 9 Deaths formation? The middle-aged man asked with a smile. Only after passing the second level can you leave your name on the eternal stone. He pointed to the row of 8 stone tablets beside him, all of which were dotted with names. Ling Han looked toward the first stone tablet. These were the 100 people who had passed the second level in the quickest time. The first name that jumped out at him was Lin Xiaoyang. Lord Lin Xiaoyang is the eldest son of Heavenly Venerate Lin Luo, the middle-aged man said with respect and reverence. Lord Lin Xiaoyang's cultivation talent isn't astounding, yet he's a person who is much wiser than he appears. Moreover, he's also a prodigy who bloomed later, with each of his footsteps solid and sturdy. Right now, he's already a 6th tier Heavenly Venerate. A thought occurred to Ling Han. Lin Luo was Zhou Heng's master, and he was more so a 7th tier Heavenly Venerate. This branch was far too freakish. Not only was the father a 7th tier Heavenly Venerate, but even his son and disciple were 6th tier Heavenly Venerates. This was truly something to envy. He looked down, and the second name that appeared was Han Yun. After that was Lu Ziyu. The middle-aged man continued to introduce them, saying, Lord Han Yun, Lord Lu Ziyu, Lord Feiyu, and Lord Long Yanyan are all prodigies from several epochs ago. As of now, they've all become Heavenly Venerates. 6th was Guang He and 7th was AMU. Ling Han's pupils contracted. He had heard of this person before. He was a freak among freaks. Chapter 2519, second level. Chapter 2519, second level. AMU was a supreme prodigy for the ages. He was ranked 7th on the stone tablet. However, this was only the ranking list for the second level of the 9 Deaths formation, so it didn't signify that he was the 7th strongest out of all those who had passed this formation before. Even so, such a high ranking was a reflection of his freakish abilities. Ling Han was more curious about why Wally wasn't ranked among the top few people. Oh, right. Even though his analysis ability was number 1 in the world, peerless among all people, engaging in fights wasn't his strong suit. Thus, passing levels that pertain to calculations and analysis would be extremely easy for Wally. However, if he needed to battle, he would need to exert much more effort. Ling Han looked further down. In 8th place was Du Shi, another supreme prodigy of the current generation. In 9th place was Heavenborn. With Heavenborn's ability, he only managed to rank 9th. It could be said that Heavenborn was the culmination and embodiment of an entire dimension's essence. Thus, he would be no less freakish than Wally. No, he was most likely even more freakish than Wally. After all, the latter had still been created by humans. Meanwhile, Heavenborn was formed by the celestial realm itself. Where had Heavenborn been inferior? Was it in battle, or was it in analysis and predictions? Ling Han believed that it was the latter. After all, in terms of battle, Heavenborn's physique was far too powerful. His body was equivalent to divine metal, so it wouldn't be difficult for him to challenge all 9 levels of the 9 Deaths formation. Even if he couldn't defeat his opponents, he could still flee with ease. Thus, he had definitely been beaten in terms of analytical ability. Even so, the fact that he had made it onto the Eternal Stone proved that his abilities had surpassed those of the countless people before him. However, there were still those who could suppress him. Moreover, some of them belonged to the same generation. In other words, Heavenborn was still slightly inferior in this area. Even though he was nurtured and born by heaven and earth, there were still limits to his abilities. Ling Han nodded in his mind. He became even more confident that he could defeat Heavenborn. This was certainly not an invincible and insurmountable opponent. Ling Han continued to look down. In 10th place was Huofarong. This was as expected of the number 1 celestial maiden of the ages. Even here, she was still as impressive as always. Looking further down, Ji Wuming was ranked 29th, while the Rain Emperor was ranked 79th. Even though this seemed low, one had to realize that being able to make it onto the Eternal Stone was already an impressive feat in itself. Where's the Empress and Hunyao? Were they not powerful enough, or was it because of some other reason? Ling Han felt like both explanations were possible. Even though the Empress and Hunyao were also monarch stars, their evolution indices had only been around 10. It wasn't all that high. In this academy, however, there were freaks who possessed evolution indices of close to 12. Trying to surpass these freaks would naturally be a challenge. Moreover, with the Empress' proud nature, perhaps she would find it beneath her to compete with others anyway. Hunyao was more so unreliable when it came to these matters. It was entirely possible that she was uninterested in these rankings. He swept his gaze around. However, before he could even look toward the second stone tablet, several people walked out from the academy gates. Heaven-born. His pupils instantly contracted. The person in the lead was none other than Heaven-born. There were already 5 ribbons of iridescent light around him, and he was like a revered leader surrounded by underlings as a dozen or so people followed behind him. Each of them was a celestial king, surrounded by 1 to 5 ribbons of iridescent light. Lord Heavenborn is going to challenge the 9 Deaths formation again. This time, perhaps Lord Heavenborn will break Lord Du's record. The celestial kings conversed among themselves as they walked, completely ignoring Ling Han and the middle-aged man. Perhaps they simply viewed them as a celestial king with his follower. As always, Heavenborn possessed a formidable aura. It was as if his body contained a primordial beast, with each of his steps causing the earth to shudder. He entered from the location of the 4th stone tablet, with his body immediately vanishing without a trace. Here, each stone tablet rested in front of the corresponding level of the 9 Deaths formation. For example, the 1st stone tablet corresponded to the 2nd level of the 9 Deaths formation. Meanwhile, the 4th stone tablet corresponded to the 5th level of the 9 Deaths formation. Right now, Heavenborn was already a 5th heaven celestial king, so he was also going to challenge the 5th level of the formation. He didn't plan to improve his results in the previous levels. Ling Han swept his gaze over the remaining stone tablets. The names on these tablets were quite different. For example, Lin Xiaoyang's name was nowhere to be seen. However, with the ability to become a 6th-tier heavenly venerate, would he not have the ability to leave his name on these stone tablets? It was clear that he hadn't wasted any of his time or effort here, or perhaps he had left his name here before, yet he had erased it afterward for one reason or another. Meanwhile, Heavenborn's name appeared on each of the first 4 tablets. On the first 3 stone tablets, he was ranked from 9th to 10th on each one. On the 4th stone tablet, however, he was only ranked 19th. Was this because Heavenborn's power suddenly became insufficient? This was naturally not the case. This was because Du Shi was only ranked 18th, while Amy was only ranked 17th. Ling Han pondered over the possible reasons. For example, it would definitely be extremely easy for him to pass the 2nd level of the 9 Deaths formation. This was because his true battle prowess had already reached the 5th heaven. This was a crushing advantage. In this sense, his results would naturally be better than if his battle prowess were only at the 2nd heaven. This was without a doubt. This was most likely the same situation for Heavenborn. For the first 3 levels, he had passed them by relying on the crushing advantage of his cultivation level. However, upon reaching the 5th level, he would no longer enjoy an advantage in terms of cultivation level. Thus, his results naturally declined. In some sense, Heavenborn's battle prowess, while at the 5th heaven, could only be ranked 19th out of everyone in history. Moreover, this was only among those who had decided to earnestly challenge this formation. Perhaps there were some prodigies who kept an extremely low profile and didn't try to create any records at all. For example, Lin Luo. He was a 7th-tier heavenly venerate, yet his name didn't appear on any of the stone tablets. The same could be said for Zhou Heng and Chu Hao. Ling Han looked at the middle-aged man with a smile and said, "I still haven't asked for your esteemed name." "Oh, Yang Ming," the middle-aged man replied with a smile. Ling Han looked at the first stone tablet and said, "Please wait for a moment. I also want to try my hand at this formation." "Please go ahead," Yang Ming said, gesturing an invitation. He was also extremely curious about how prodigious Ling Han was. This would also dictate how he treated him in the future. Ling Han entered the 9 Deaths formation from the location of the first stone tablet. His surroundings didn't appear to change at all. However, after taking a few steps, a wooden puppet suddenly appeared before him. This was identical to the situation in the first level. Boom! The wooden puppet immediately charged over, throwing a punch. Symbols lit up, and it was clear that it had a battle prowess at the peak stage of the second heaven. This was the second level of the formation, so all of the challenges were designed with second heaven celestial kings in mind. Ling Han attacked, easily defeating his opponent. After several more battles, he appeared before an expanse of fog. Sure enough, this was identical to the first level. The only difference was that the opponents were more powerful. He entered the fog, immediately inviting attacks from powerful enemies. Their battle prowess was slightly stronger, and perhaps even ordinary emperor tiers would be unable to rival them. Ling Han advanced with confidence. These opponents were merely small fry to him. After a short while, he arrived before a city that sat between 2 towering mountains. This was again identical to the first level. He had to rearrange these shards into words. He looked toward the city gates. Boom! Countless shards surged into his mind, greater in number and more chaotic in manner. Sure enough, it was much more difficult than before. Like before, Ling Han first separated these shards into groups. After sorting them into over 40 groups, he then rearranged them all at once. After 15 or so minutes, he suddenly opened his eyes. Numerous complete symbols pulsated in his eyes. This time, it wasn't words that had been formed. Instead, these were symbols of the Great Tao. This was extremely mysterious. Symbols of the Great Tao could actually be used like this. Whoosh! He was swept into the city. However, the symbols of the Great Tao didn't vanish. At this moment, Ling Han suddenly started to hesitate. Should he continue to advance, or should he stop to investigate these symbols? He had a feeling that these symbols were extraordinary. After a brief moment of hesitation, Ling Han eventually decided to sit down. Compared to strength, mere reputation was worth nothing. Chapter 2528. Chapter 2528. Ling Han sat down, completely focused as he pondered the symbols of the Great Tao. He was in no hurry to pass this formation. After all, this was a rare opportunity for him to comprehend these symbols of the Great Tao. However, if he wanted to challenge this formation, he could do so at any time. After at least 3 days, Ling Han finally stood up in satisfaction. He had reaped huge benefits this time. These symbols of the Great Tao had most likely been gathered and formed by the magnificent power of heavenly venerates. To a third heaven celestial king such as him, they were indescribably useful and beneficial. It was no wonder that some prodigies hadn't made it onto the Eternal Stone. It was because they had been distracted here, spending a great deal of time comprehending these symbols of the Great Tao. The gap between these prodigies was already small to begin with, so could they afford to waste 3 days here? Even though there was no explicit rule or explanation, Ling Han had a feeling that each person would only have a single chance to comprehend these symbols. Such rare opportunities could only come through fortune, not through searching. Ling Han pondered for a moment. Should he challenge this formation again? Making a conscious effort to achieve a higher ranking was not something that he liked. However, in order to suppress Heavenborn, he was willing to challenge this level again. He strode forward, easily breezing through the war soldiers that stood before him. War soldiers at the second heaven naturally couldn't slow him down. He arrived before the large river again. Just like before, stone platforms bobbed up and down, with their speed incredibly astonishing. There was even less of a pattern this time, and this gave Ling Han a huge headache. After an entire day, he finally made sense of the patterns behind the movements. He immediately leaped forward. Xiao, xiao, xiao. In just a few dozen jumps, he arrived on the other side of the river. After arriving here, he had essentially passed the 9 Deaths formation already. Sure enough, after walking for a short while, a stone tablet appeared before him again. Surprisingly, this was exactly where he had entered the formation from. Congratulations on passing the second level, Ouyangming said. He was still standing in the same spot, and a smile spread across his face when he saw Ling Han arrive. Even though Ling Han's result was unable to win him a spot on the Eternal Stone, just his ability to pass the second level alone was already outstanding. At the very least, it deserved his respect. Follow me. I'll bring you to your residence, he said. However, Ling Han waved his hand and said, I want to challenge this level again. Ouyangming frowned upon hearing this. What was the hurry? Moreover, Ling Han had only just passed the level, so how much could his result improve if he immediately challenged it again? In any case, he had spent 4 entire days to pass the level, a time far inferior to what was needed to enter the rankings. The others all waited for several years before challenging the formation again, raising their power to a peak state. With Ling Han's request, not only would his result not improve, but it might even decline. However, since Ling Han insisted, there would be no point for Ouyangming to object. All right, I'll wait for you, he said. Ling Han smiled before entering the second level again. There was nothing much to say about the early challenges. He simply steamrolled them with his crushing power. After arriving before the city gates, he unleashed all of his power. If he wanted to defeat Heavenborn, he wouldn't be able to do so in the stages that involved battle. His only chance to defeat Heavenborn was in terms of comprehension and analytical ability. Meanwhile, Ling Han was extremely confident in these areas. After a short while, Ling Han successfully rearranged the 40 words. This time they were genuine words and not symbols of the great Tao. He was drawn into the city, where he immediately unleashed his ferocious power. Pung, pung, pung. His fists were invincible, and he bulldozed through the war soldiers before arriving at the large river. Even though this was still the second level, the patterns of the bobbling rock platforms changed again. Ling Han took another day to comprehend the mysterious patterns of their movement. He immediately bounded forward. Xiao, xiao, xiao. In a few bounds, he arrived on the opposite bank. He then strode forward. When he exited the formation, he coincidentally saw Heavenborn also walking out from behind the 4th stone tablet. His brows were furrowed, and it was clear that he was extremely displeased. It was evident that he hadn't achieved any breakthroughs in his result. Thus, he was naturally extremely displeased. Friend. Ouyangming stammered as he walked over. His voice was quivering. Ling Han looked over. What was he so astonished about? Congratulations, friend. You've made it into the rankings. Ouyangming finally said. He could finally form a proper sentence again. He was truly unable to fathom how Ling Han's results had improved by so much. Last time, it had taken Ling Han 4 entire days to pass the level. This time, however, he had directly made it into the rankings. Ling Han nodded in acknowledgement. He knew that he would definitely make it into the rankings. However, the most important thing was where he ranked. Where did I rank? He asked. 8th. Ouyangming replied. This result was far too terrifying. In terms of the prodigies who were still at the Martial Academy, only AMU had achieved a better result than this. Du Shi, Heavenborn, Huoferong, and the others had all been pushed down the ranking. 8th. Ling Han was slightly astonished. Even though he hadn't performed to the best of his potential, he was still slightly disappointed that he had only ranked 8th. In his mind, it should have been fairly easy to challenge the top 5 positions. Now, however, the gap between them was still fairly large. However, upon further thought, he immediately felt at ease. At the end of the day, the celestial realm was only a super low-level dimension. Moreover, his evolution index was only 11, perhaps slightly higher. However, it definitely hadn't reached 12. That being the case, was it strange that his result was inferior to those freaks' results? Instead, this caused his fighting spirit to soar. He decided to compete with those freaks in the 3rd level after he fully recovered his cultivation. After all, this result was because of his crushing advantage in cultivation level. It didn't reflect his true abilities. This was evident by looking at the 5th level. 8 Mu, Heavenborn, and the others were all ranked around 20th. Heavenborn had already turned around to leave. Yet upon hearing Ouyang Ming's reply, he violently turned around. 8th. Then wouldn't he be pushed down? He swept his gaze over. Sure enough, his name had fallen from 9th to 10th. Displeasure instantly spread across Heavenborn's face. This was because he detested the feeling of being inferior to others. It was also because of this that he challenged this formation time and time again. He yearned to surpass everyone above him. Now, however, he had actually been suppressed by a new disciple. This ticked him off immensely. However, he immediately humphed before turning around to leave. This was only the 2nd level after all. Thus, many people suppress their cultivation level to challenge this formation. Even though their battle prowess would be suppressed, their divine sense wouldn't be affected at all. Thus, they would possess a huge advantage when it came to rearranging the words and crossing the river. Ling Han's cultivation level was unclear, so it was evident that he had concealed it on purpose. Perhaps he was a 9th heaven celestial king. Thus, Heavenborn felt he needed not pay any heed to this. The only people who could grab his attention were the Martial Academy's AMU, Dushi, and so on. These were all prodigies who possessed evolution indices of 12 or above. As for these lowly cultivators who didn't even dare to show their cultivation or face, it was beneath him to pay any attention to them. Meanwhile, Ling Han gazed at Heavenborn's leaving figure. In the near future, he would defeat this person in a fair and square battle, not just through this kind of meaningless method. Friend Zhang, you're truly outstanding, Ouyang Ming said in praise. Regardless of whether he was a high-level celestial king or not, his ability to enter the rankings alone was already a reflection of his boundless talent. Toward this kind of person, he didn't need to simply become associated with them. Instead, he needed to curry favor with and toad up to them. Ouyang Ming brought Ling Han into the academy. This was an endless mountain range that looked like an entire world. Even with Ling Han's powerful vision, he still couldn't see the end. Under Ouyang Ming's arrangement, he received an abode that was rich with spiritual qi. This was a holy land for cultivation. After sending off Ouyang Ming, Ling Han took out the cauldron that he had purchased not long ago. He planned to test its ability to refine alchemical pills. Chapter 2521, Returning to the 3rd Heaven. Chapter 2521, Returning to the 3rd Heaven. The most special thing about this cauldron was its sturdiness. However, a good pill refinement cauldron needed more than just sturdiness. It also needed a powerful ability to resist flames. This was especially the case when it came to refining celestial king tier pills. To refine such pills, one would need to use flames extracted from the great Tao of fire. Even divine metal would be slowly melted by such flames. Divine metal was sturdy, yet this didn't represent that it couldn't be damaged. It was just that it couldn't be comprehensively destroyed. Ling Han's comprehension of the great Tao of fire wasn't deep, but he had still developed a sliver of understanding because he had refined a piece of divine metal before. He immediately summoned the great Tao of fire to burn the cauldron. To his surprise, the cauldron didn't show any signs of softening, even though it quickly became bright red. It was extremely resistant to flames. Upon further thought, Ling Han speculated that this was because some kind of peculiar clay had been added to the materials used in the making of this cauldron. Clay was far more resistant to flames than metal, so by mixing the two together, the resulting cauldron would naturally possess powerful resistance to flames. Of course, this couldn't be achieved with ordinary clay, nor could it be achieved with ordinary metal. In my view, this metal is most likely derived from the impurities produced in the process of purifying divine metal. Thus, it doesn't possess the intensity and murderous aura of divine metal, but its sturdiness can almost rival that of divine metal. The difference is that divine metal has the ability to regenerate itself, while this metal most likely doesn't. It's genuinely sturdy, but once it's damaged, it's genuinely damaged as well. Even after fixing it, there will still be imperfections. This is unlike divine metal, which is whole to begin with. As if it possesses life, it possesses the ability to heal and regenerate. However, to me, this cauldron is indeed very useful. I finally have a high-quality pill refinement cauldron. Ling Han was extremely satisfied. Right now, he naturally needed to refine Celestial King tier pills. Thus, his requirements for the necessary cauldron were also extremely strict. Otherwise, what would he do if the cauldron melted halfway through the pill refinement process? For example, refining the Celestial King pills had given him a massive headache. He put the cauldron aside. He then started to cultivate in seclusion, keeping an extremely low profile. This was even though countless people wanted to visit him. After all, regardless of how he had achieved it, his ability to enter the rankings proved a single point. His talent was lofty and boundless. Such a person was naturally worth buttering up to. However, Ling Han was in no mood to make new friends. Right now, his goal was to improve his cultivation. To say nothing of advancing to the fourth heaven, he at least had to return to the third heaven no matter what. He activated the full power of his physique. He then activated the regulations of time, accelerating time and increasing the speed of his cultivation. This was a transcendent dimension, so not only were there more regulations, but they were also more powerful. Indeed, even monarch tier, celestial kings from the celestial realm might be defeated by ordinary celestial kings from this realm. Thus, Ling Han wasn't simply undergoing a process of recultivation. At the same time, he was also improving his grasp of the regulations. The days passed one by one. Meanwhile, Ling Han's cultivation level also continued to rise. Each year, the Martial Academy would distribute an astonishing amount of cultivation resources. This was the only transcendent dimension in the Genesis world, so it naturally possessed an astonishingly rich amount of cultivation resources. Now that all of these resources had been gathered together, there was naturally enough to support the wild and fervent cultivation of these supreme prodigies. Ling Han naturally didn't use any of these resources. After all, he was still far from reaching the Celestial King tier. There was no hurry. In any case, these resources wouldn't go to waste. 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years. Before long, 7,000 years had already passed. To celestial kings, even though 7,000 years was more than just the blink of an eye, it was still an insignificant and short moment compared to their exorbitantly long lifespan. The world's paramount Martial Academy didn't experience any exciting incidents, either. Even though 1 or 2 more people had passed the 9 Deaths formation, becoming proper disciples of the Martial Academy, they hadn't been anywhere near as freakish as Ling Han. Thus, they naturally hadn't caused a ripple. Meanwhile, Ling Han had kept an extremely low profile this entire time, not showing himself once in the 7,000 years. As such, even though he had caused a huge commotion before, he was also gradually forgotten. Some people speculated that he had used some kind of peculiar technique to pass the formation, perhaps even exhausting his life force. It was because of this that he had achieved such an outstanding result. At the same time, it was also because of this that he had been recuperating all these years. Otherwise, why would he not show himself after achieving such an outstanding feat? If Ling Han exited seclusion at this moment and revealed his true identity, he could definitely still cause a huge commotion. However, if he didn't reveal his identity, perhaps not a single person would recognize him. It was at this moment that Ling Han finally concluded his seclusion. Third Heaven Celestial King. He had finally returned to his original cultivation level. Moreover, he had become even more powerful. However, even though I've become more powerful, the others have also grown more powerful as well. I don't possess any advantage. On the contrary, even though my power of regulations has improved, my body art hasn't seen any improvement at all. In reality, my advantage has been weakened, Ling Han murmured to himself. However, he wasn't disappointed in the least. This was because he was filled with confidence. He was more so filled with fighting spirit. Having competition was always good. Prodigies from countless dimensions are all gathered here, so perhaps there are some people who are keeping an extremely low profile. As such, they're most likely far more elites than those who appear on the Eternal Stone. I truly want to head out for a battle. Ling Han stood up. He had already rested for long enough. It was time to go out for a stroll. He first had a hearty gathering with his wives in the spatial celestial tool, after which he collected all of the cultivation resources that he had been given. He then left his abode and casually strolled through the mountains. After arriving at the waist of the mountain, he saw that there was a library located here. He walked inside for a look. This library wasn't filled with ancient books, and it housed numerous jade seals instead. As long as one released their divine sense to make contact with a jade seal, they could construct a channel through which the information from the jade seal would travel through. This was extremely convenient and fast. Moreover, these jade seals could also become vessels that could host the divine senses of many people at once, allowing them to communicate and discuss their comprehensions. This was incredibly mysterious and wonderful. According to rumors, this process had been implemented after studying the technology of some technologically advanced dimensions. This library was extremely large, and it more so held countless jade seals. There were also dedicated rooms that only held a single jade seal, and many more people would be standing around these. It was due to the popularity of these jade seals that they had been placed into dedicated rooms. Ling Han walked up to the first jade seal that he encountered in the library. This was the largest jade seal, yet it didn't possess any cultivation technique or whatnot. Instead, this was a directory and catalog for the library. He scanned through the information. This library truly contained everything. There were jade seals about astrology, geography, history, pill refinement, tool refinement, and so on. Of course, there were even more on cultivation techniques, with many of them powerful enough to be regarded as paramount mystical powers in the celestial realm. Even Ninth Heaven celestial king forces would fight to the death over them. Here, however, they were available for everyone to learn. Of course, this only applied to the disciples of the Martial Academy. To call itself the world's paramount, this academy was indeed powerful and domineering. Even celestial king-tier secret techniques were freely available for everyone to study. A thought suddenly occurred to Ling Han. Right now, only his fists of fury could be regarded as a self-created technique. However, all of his other techniques had been learned from other people. This was far too inferior. If he wanted to become a heavenly venerate, he would need to forge a unique path for himself. He would elevate the level of his fists of fury first. In fact, this was a technique that he had created while he was still at the dividing soul tier. Now, however, he was already at the celestial king tier. Thus, he naturally needed to refine and improve it. However, could he refine and improve it just because he wanted to? He walked over to the fist technique section. There were countless secret techniques regarding fists here, and Ling Han greedily used his divine sense to absorb all of this information. However, he didn't practice these techniques. Instead, he simply consulted them and used them as references. He was going to take the advantages of each and then combine them with his own comprehension. Right now, he was simply absorbing this information. Brother Ding, are you going to the prospective partner ceremony? Chapter 2522. Off to defend my wife. Chapter 2522. Off to defend my wife. Prospective partner ceremony? Haha. Are you talking about that drinking party hosted by Xianing? When did it become a prospective partner ceremony? Oh, I heard the members of the Martial Academy say that this drinking party would be called a conference of cultivation. But in truth, it is a prospective partner ceremony. There is a mighty figure in the Martial Academy that thinks that everyone should not just be focused on cultivation and should find some time to find a partner as well. That's true. We people are too excellent. Previously, we have concentrated fully on cultivation and did not have the idle time to be concerned about any romantic affairs. By now, ordinary women would not be worthy of our notice at all, and probably only the empresses here would be worthy of us. Brother Ding, let me tell you, even Goddess Luan Xing would be going. What, Goddess Luan Xing is also going? Of course. Because of her, a few extraordinary beings would also appear at the same time, such as Gu Haoyi, Xiaoing Xiong Miao Hua. Hiss, these monsters. The sound of the conversation between the two transmitted continuously, allowing Ling Han to grasp it. It could not be helped. The jade seal was a container, and whoever sent out a message through divine sense would be heard by others who had contact with the jade seal. Originally, this was meant to make it convenient for others to share ideas, and was not supposed to be used for idle conversation. A thought flashed across Ling Han's mind: the Empress would be attending the prospective partner ceremony. He could not believe the Empress would do such a thing, even if it killed him. Even if he really had died, with how proud the Empress was, she would not deign to go either. She was the type to have men kneel down and look up at her while she slowly made her choice. The Empress was probably kept in the dark. Her main reason for attending this drinking party was for the sake of discussing cultivation. Then he could only go and take a look for himself. Otherwise, what was he to do if someone snatched his wife? Those two people were just talking about the drinking party when the direction of their conversation naturally turned towards the beauties of the Martial Academy. Because the Martial Academy had existed for a number of epochs, even if there were slightly fewer female prodigies. After so many years, a great many female prodigies had also been accumulated, and there would naturally be exquisite beauties among them. An extremely small number of them advanced to become heavenly venerates, but the majority had only progressed until the 9th heaven celestial king tier. There were some among them that were still cultivating in the Martial Academy, and some that were traveling all around, looking for opportunities that would allow them to break through to that cultivation level which they yearned for. There was also a ranking of beauties in the Martial Academy that had listed the most beautiful women throughout the ages. In fact, there were even other time-differentiated ranking lists with a range of 10 billion years. Actually, it was also the same for male prodigies. Only a rare few had become heavenly venerates, and the majority was still stagnating on the level of 9th heaven. The men also had rankings, but what was being considered was naturally not their looks, but rather strength. For example, in the latest ranking of strength, the one at the very top was not heaven-born, but rather Gu Hui, Xiaoing Xiong, and the others. They were already in the 6th heaven. To be accepted as students by the Martial Academy, they would have to be monarch tiers at least, and those that could be ranked in the upper echelons were even more likely to be monarch stars. In fact, they would have to be freaks with evolution index that reached 11 or 12. Gu Hai, Xiaoing Xiong, and Miao Hua were such freaks that even heaven-born had no choice but be ranked inferior to them. Of course, this was because they had suppression through their superior cultivation level, and in terms of a real battle of equals, it was definitely heaven-born that was stronger, or he would not have ranked so highly on the Eternal Stone. It should be known that the names of Xiaoing Xiong and the others were not ranked on it. It was also possible that they could not be bothered with this kind of ranking. Ling Han developed some understanding. All in all, the pressure on him now was very heavy. Even if there weren't 10,000 people that desired his wife, there had to be 8,000. Furthermore, they were all the super geniuses of the martial academy. Right, off to defend my wife, Ling Han thought as he continued to pluck the essence of various fist techniques. A day later, he left the library and returned to his accommodations, where he began to meld these fist techniques together. While his ability of deduction could not be compared to Wally's, it was definitely in the highest tier. With the time acceleration effects, boundless enlightenment rose up inside him. However, after 2 days had passed in real time, he had no choice but to stop. The drinking party was about to begin. He changed his clothes so he would appear more alert. However, he naturally would not be showing his real appearance. He was sure that the Empress Hunyeo and the others would still be able to recognize him, even if it had been 1,000,000 years since they parted. He looked again and again at the mirror, and when he felt he was handsome enough, he pushed open the doors and left. When the two people from before had conversed, Ling Han had also found out where this drinking party would be held. Thus, he headed there directly after he exited from his place. The drinking party was hosted by a person called Xianing, who was a veteran prodigy, and going by the time-different rankings of 100 million years, he was someone from the last 2 generations and had long since reached the 9th heaven celestial king tier. There were not many students that did not leave after attaining 9th heaven. That was because the majority would follow heavenly venerates to battle with Hysteria outside the realm. Though they would only be minor characters and it would be extremely dangerous, the possibility of gaining enlightenment in such extremely dangerous circumstances would also be slightly higher. It could be said that the majority of heavenly venerates had broken through in the realm battlefield. Actually, Xianing had also gone to the realm battlefield before and had now come back for a rest. While he was at it, he had taken heed of the idea of some powerful figure in the martial academy and decided to host a drinking party so he could get to know these little brothers and sisters and fill them in on the cruelties of the realm battlefield. His abode was located midway on a peak. Though it was also in the martial academy, there really was a far distance. Even if Ling Han raced madly with all his might, he would only be able to arrive after probably 2 hours at least. Tap, 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 a sound rang out from behind him. Ling Han was surprised. Though he was not running at full speed, his speed was already overwhelming, and someone actually managed to catch up to him. He turned his head and saw that it was a carriage that was nearing him quickly, and it was actually being pulled by a dragon. Dragons were the strongest of immortal beasts. They were incredibly powerful creatures, and it was said that they could become celestial kings upon birth. With merely this fact alone, what other race could compare in this world? Hence, dragons were also extremely proud beings. Ling Han had never seen celestial-level dragons in the celestial realm before, because the sealed emotion, Heavenly Venerable, had turned the ancestor dragon into a precious tool, while other dragons had basically perished in the war against the invasion of the foreign realm. Similarly, it was the same for the Phoenix race as well. The ancestor Phoenix had similarly died in the hands of the sealed emotion, Heavenly Venerable. This was his first time seeing a great celestial king-tier dragon, but it was actually playing the role of steed. This caused Ling Han some amount of surprise. Xiao, the dragon, soared past, and the carriage also passed him by. The body of the carriage was heavily covered with seals. Clearly, this was no ordinary item, either. Otherwise, how could it be able to sustain this kind of speed? It would have long since broken apart. Idiot, come on and chase me. A head stuck itself out of the carriage window, yelling at Ling Han in provocation. Originally, Ling Han would not have taken it to heart even if he had been surpassed. He would only muse ruefully how his first encounter with a great celestial king-tier dragon would actually be like this. Yet he had not expected that he would be mocked even when he was just going his own way. The other party was a man, and he was very young. He laughed loudly, and when he said his piece, he sat back down in his carriage. The inner space in the carriage was very lavish, with thick carpets laid out on the floor. Aside from him, there was another purple-robed young man that was sipping wine. Seeing that he had withdrawn his head, This person held the stem of the wine cup gingerly and asked calmly, "Young Masterswa, is this really good?" "What's bad about it? A mere third heaven celestial king that does not even have a means of transport. What kind of important person could he be?" This man countered. His name was Shuakai, and he had a prestigious identity. His grandfather was a pseudo-heavenly venerate, though it did have the attachment of the word pseudo, so he had not advanced into the invincible cultivation level, as long as there was the slightest link to heavenly venerable tier. Could that not be awesome enough? Thus, Shuakai was naturally arrogant. The purple-robed young man was just about to speak when he spluttered out all the wine in his mouth with a sudden "Piu!"